on the science behind that delay, or the science behind skipping the second shot while we roll out the first shot to more people. The trials that were done were very specific and a very focused regimen: first shot, certain period of time later, second shot, and then tracking the immune response of the individuals who participated in those trials. That being said, we can infer information based on the results of people who are starting to get that first shot of that vaccine. And I think one of the pieces that we need to focus on is ramping up the capacity to give that first shot, and then making sure that we have the production to ensure that the second shots are available for all those people. So I think right now the priority should be to stick to the regimen, but also think about the logistics of giving more people that first shot, and then planning for the second shot when the time comes.
Lauren, thank you so much. Lauren Sauer there of Johns Hopkins, and be sure to check out VRUS Go on the Bloomberg for the latest information. You can also tune in every day for our exclusive conversation with Johns Hopkins experts for an inside look at battling COVID-19. Now, coming up on Bloomberg Technology, of course, we continue tracking COVID-19, a big news day, not only for vaccinations, but of course what the Biden administration taking over from 12 p.m. New York time, Washington time, will mean for the fight of the U.S. against the pandemic. Later on, we speak with Noubar Afeyan, the Moderna chairman and co-founder. That's at 5:30 p.m. in New York, 10:30 p.m. in London. President-elect Joe Biden planning to begin immediately unwinding President Donald Trump's policies on immigration, climate, and other issues starting today, with at least 15 executive actions, including moves to reverse U.S. withdrawals from the Paris Agreement and the World Health Organization, but also stop the construction of a border wall. We'll have full inauguration coverage.
It's extremely exciting for the university, for being a historically black college and university. It's just exciting for our engineers to actually be allowed to work for a large firm such as Boeing with such technologies that we can see the outcome.
Bloomberg has enhanced search on the terminal to deliver what you need when you need it. Now, you can simply type phrases in everyday English in the command line. Compare financials. Find people. Analyze markets. You can enter phrases or ask questions. What do you want to know today? Ask a question or visit Search Go to find answers now.
news anymore. It's bad news reflecting really painful couple months ahead for the economy.
There's the possibility for the first time in a very long time of more people falling back into poverty.
All of the telltale signs of a structural bull market at play here.
Kind of ironic that the worse it gets, the better it gets for the market conditions.
The market for the last few months has been driven by valuation more than earnings.
A lot of monetary stimulus coming in, there's a lot of fiscal stimulus coming in, and there's recovery from COVID. It's kind of like a 2009 year.
This is Bloomberg Surveillance with Tom Keene, Jonathan Farrow, and Lisa Abramowitz.
From New York City, for our audience worldwide, good morning, good morning. This is Bloomberg Surveillance live on Bloomberg TV and radio. Alongside Tom Keene and Lisa Abramowitz, I'm Jonathan Farrow. With equity futures inching just a little bit higher, it's Inauguration Day in America. Tom Keene, Joe Biden becoming the next president of the United States.
Joseph Biden will. This will happen at 12 noon. David Weston picking up our coverage at 11 a.m. And John, unity is the theme. That's always the theme. And, you know, across the history, we've got a great video from Sarah Rappaport we'll show, really ready for radio as well. And across the eras, it's unity until it's not. And you really wonder, John, when exactly do the Republicans look to 2022?
An emergency setting, Tom, a crisis, which we're still in with the pandemic. That's fertile ground to make policy down in Washington. Once that starts to fade just a little bit more, once that vaccination rollout improves even more so, Tom, how do you start to get together in D.C.? Does that will to do more, that bipartisan effort, does that fade, and how quickly does it fade? I think people all think it fades pretty fast.
It'll be a lot of symbolism today, John, on to that effort. Of course, you've got efforts like a bipartisan attendance at St. Matthew's Church by the president-elect. Mr. McConnell, I believe, will be there as well. You've got the other symbolism through the day, including President Trump heading out to Florida. I believe we'll have images of that in a bit. But, John, you got to get beyond this Wednesday to what they do with impeachment and what they do with this economy.
Well, let's start with this Wednesday, Lisa. The play-by-play. It all starts in about 60 minutes' time.
Exactly. Within the next hour, 8 a.m., President Trump is expected to leave the White House for Palm Beach, Florida. He will be the first president not to attend the inauguration of his successor since the 19th century. 12 p.m., Joe Biden and Kamala Harris are sworn in as president and vice president, the 46th president, the 49th vice president. Yes, the theme will be unity, but they will be speaking to a somber Washington, D.C., with thousands of troops there trying to gird for any potential violence and protecting them in a pandemic that has absolutely ravaged the economy. And at 5:15 p.m., Joe Biden is planning to sign at least 15 executive orders, including a mask mandate, including rolling back certain immigration curbs that President Trump put in place, and including halting the building of the wall down on the Texas-Mexico border. Really interesting to see what Joe Biden does in his first 100 days as he faces an economy and a nation that has been divided and absolutely ravaged by a pandemic, John.
Going into those events, here's the price action for you worldwide, starting in the United States with equity futures this Wednesday morning. Good morning to you all. Equity futures positive about 14 points on the S&P 500, up a third of 1%. We'll be catching up with Tobias Lefkovich a little bit later this hour over at Citi with a 3,800 price target year-end on the S&P. Tom Keene, where did we close just yesterday in Tuesday's session? We closed at 37.99 on the S&P 500. We're already at the year-end targets of many big strategists on Wall Street.
Yeah. Well, no, I agree with you. So 38.04 right now. I know you're going to do a data check, John, but 38.04 on SPX up 14 points, and Dow at 31,000 speaks volumes as well. John, I would go to where Gina Martin Adams is, which is if you get a stimulus, you get 20% earnings growth. I don't know how to model earnings growth of 20% other than higher stock prices.
We'll get to Tobias a little bit later this hour. We've got to begin with the big event down in Washington, D.C., and we do that by crossing over to Bloomberg's Kevin Cirilli. Kevin, talk us through the main event. It all kicks off in a couple of hours' time.
Good morning. Behind me, they are testing the audio. This, as we are now just hours away from President-elect Joe Biden's inaugural address. He will kick off the morning with a bipartisan showing as he and congressional leaders go to St. Matthew's Cathedral here in Washington, D.C. for a mass ceremony. Biden becoming, of course, the second Catholic president in United States history. From there, they will then make their way to the Capitol, which, of course, just more than a week ago was the scene to a horrific mob attack that ended and resulted in President Trump getting impeached. We could hear remarks from President Trump within the next 2 hours as he departs the White House to go to Florida. But without question, I'm told that Biden's address to the nation, to the world really, will be one of a unifying message. One, as he tries to change the tide, so to speak, of how America has dealt with the coronavirus. We should note that later today at the White House, he is expected to take a series of executive orders, including re-entering into the Paris Climate Accords. That, of course, a marked policy difference from what the Trump administration did several years ago.
Kevin Surley, what do you predict for the senator from New York and the senator from Kentucky? I'm fascinated about the transfer of power among those strong-minded Senate minority-majority leaders.
Because the majority is so slim, virtually by one vote, and a tie-breaking by soon-to-be Vice President Kamala Harris, Leader McConnell still has significant political capital that he will have at his disposal in terms of negotiating a $1.9 trillion economic stimulus deal, or even, rather, different health care policies that this administration would like to see changed. On immigration, another reversal that the incoming administration would like to see America change its course on. Republicans very much divided with Democrats on terms of how to do that. But candidly, whether or not there will be a shift in tone, we got a preview of that yesterday in the Senate when Leader McConnell criticized the outgoing administration and President Trump for the attack on the Capitol. So maybe, just maybe, there'll be a different tone in Washington. And we should note, and this is important, Vice President-elect Kamala Harris about to shatter a massive glass ceiling and becoming the nation's first female vice president, and her remarks will be equally as important.
Indeed, Kevin, we'll be listening to those. We've got to get past Wednesday, as John was saying, and right now we've got a Wednesday that is inundated with troops that are infiltrating Washington, D.C., trying to prevent any violence. What's the mood right now? Can you give us a sense of what this lockdown feels like and how long it's expected to last?
Candidly, it typically takes me about 15 minutes to get to the Capitol. It took me an hour and a half today. And I live in downtown D.C. And I bring this up because there has never, in my nearly decade-long reporting in Washington, D.C., have I ever witnessed anything like the security presence that is here in Washington, D.C. The only thing, and Lisa, truly, the only thing that comes close is when the Pope came to Washington, D.C. But as you alluded to, 25,000 National Guards all throughout the city, really, it really scattered everywhere and really protecting the city in a way that is unprecedented.
Kevin, away from the pomp and the circumstance, we on the simulcast have reported on a fractured labor economy. Do the fancy people on the west front of the Capitol today, do they actually understand the statistics we report every day about our labor, our dearth of consumption and retail sales, and our collapsed world trade? Do they have a clue?
There was a moment yesterday in a tone in which she urged there to be another round of economic relief passed as a result of helping those individuals that you just alluded to. But we should note that the left and the right have very different solutions to the labor crisis, really, in this country. You know, I would note that one of the glaring omissions, even as Americans seek and the president-elect seeks to have unity, one of the glaring omissions will be President Trump from these inaugural festivities and ceremonies. When President-elect Biden, as well as Vice President-elect Kamala Harris and other bipartisan congressional leaders visit the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier, and President Trump is not there, that will be an historic, sobering moment to see those photographs, images, and sounds as that plays out. But I'm struck by Tom, and you always do this. I'm struck by the magnitude and the history of this moment. If you look at the flags behind me where President-elect Biden will speak, it's the various stages of the American flags dating back to Betsy Ross. I bring this up because it was at the first departing address when George Washington warned of political party divisions. Now America faces a crossroad, facing a deep divide economically as well as with the global health pandemic.
And John, what's so important here, going back to Lincoln's 1831 speech in Springfield, John, what's so important here is the same economics tearing this nation apart, which is the inequality that is perceived and real out there.
Tom, today's about tradition, it's about convention, and in many ways it's not conventional. But I think there's an obsession around policy at the moment and a return to the traditional, conventional way of making policy. But Kevin, what's interesting about the incoming administration is where the policy won't change. When we heard from the incoming Secretary Janet Yellen, or presumed Secretary Janet Yellen, just yesterday, I have to say on the subject of China, she sounded like the Trump administration. Blinken on China, sounding like the Trump administration. We might change how we make policy down in D.C. We might go back to old ways, but will the policy actually change on issues as big as China? Kevin, will they?
No. And Jonathan, you and I have talked about this for quite some time. And to your point precisely, yesterday, Tony Blinken, testifying in the Senate for his confirmation hearing to be Secretary of State, noted that there was still quite some time before renegotiating an Iran nuclear disarmament deal. This, of course, is Democrats and the Obama administration had created that deal that the Trump administration withdrew from. Elsewhere on the geopolitical front, North Korea, elsewhere beyond North Korea, China, all of these significant geopolitical issues. I think where you're going to see a key difference immediately in the next couple of days is the outreach that President-elect Biden does to European allies. He is going to try to strengthen the European alliance with the United States in order to take a much more multilateral approach. But on issues pertaining to trade and on issues pertaining to cybersecurity, the Biden administration is not going to make significant changes in the immediate short term. Finally, we've talked about the stimulus, but when you talk about 5G and technology, that's also going to be similar to the Trump administration.
Kevin, thank you, sir. We'll catch up with you later. Tom, I think this is just absolutely critical. We might go back to the traditional way of doing things. The reporters will get things under embargo. You'll see it there before you'll see it on Twitter. But as for the policy, how much will the policy actually change?
It'll change having to do with the primaries of 2022.
From New York City for our audience worldwide, on this inauguration day in the United States of America, this is Bloomberg.
With the First Word News, I'm Emma Chandra. President-elect Biden plans to immediately begin rolling back some of President Trump's policies today. He has targeted immigration, climate and other issues with at least 15 executive actions. They include reversing the U.S. withdrawals from the Paris Agreement and the World Health Organization. He'll also stop construction of the border wall and revoke a permit for the controversial Keystone XL pipeline. It's a sobering milestone. The U.S. has now seen more than 400,000 deaths blamed on the coronavirus. There's also been 24 million infections. That makes the U.S. the global leader in both categories. Incoming President Joe Biden has vowed to speed up the vaccination process. New York Governor Andrew Cuomo needs a nice chunk of that stimulus proposal that President-elect Biden is pushing. Cuomo warned of tax hikes on the wealthy and cuts to schools if he can't get $15 billion in aid. He says he'll sue the federal government if New York doesn't get what he calls its fair share. Netflix ended the biggest year in company history with a surprise. The world's leading paid streaming service added more customers than expected and says it no longer needs to borrow money to build its entertainment empire. Netflix added 8.5 million new customers in the final 3 months of the year. It now has more than 200 million customers. Global news 24 hours a day, on air and on Bloomberg Quick Take, powered by more than 2,700 journalists and analysts in more than 120 countries. I'm Emma Chandra. This is Bloomberg.
live has been interrupted. Uninterrupted service is peace of mind. Kimmy from customer support is responding to a 500% increase in daily call volume, no matter what. We keep on, so you can keep on.
Access the financial world on demand. Hear from leading economists, policymakers, and industry experts via live and on-demand webinars, only from Bloomberg. Start exploring to see what's moving the markets. Visit Bloomberg.com/webinars.
This week, we inaugurate a new administration and pray for its success in keeping America safe and prosperous. We extend our best wishes, and we also want them to have luck.
My family and I are about to return to Washington to meet a black woman of South Asian descent to be sworn in as President and Vice President of the United States. As I told Bo on that station waiting for Barack and Hunter and Ashley, I said, don't tell me things can't change. They can, and they do. That's America.
It is Inauguration Day in the United States of America. Joe Biden will become the 46th president of the United States. For our audience worldwide, from New York City, alongside Tom Keene and Lisa Abramovich, I'm Jonathan Ferro. In your equity market this morning, this Wednesday morning, we push higher, up 13 on the S&P 500, up 1/3% after a decent day of gains. In yesterday's session, a bond market that remains quite stable this morning, yields up by around about a basis point or so to 1.1% on a 30-year yield up to about 185, Tom. And Chair Yellen becoming Secretary Yellen, willing to go big
Different
and
tone.
willing to issue more debt.
Yeah, I thought a different tone, John. What'd you think? I just thought it was a different Yellen. It was interesting.
I think it was interesting to hear about the politics, get her political views, and hear what she thought about things like China. And I think we actually got some insight. And I don't think she was scared to tell us what she thought either.
I was surprised. There's no end for buts about that. Right now, to join us, Tobias Levkovich with Citigroup, head of global markets and equity strategy as well. And Tobias, I know and you understand you're not going to raise your SPX call until the Canadians beat the Maple Leafs. I mean, I understand that. We just got to wait until good things happen. But I am interested in what is the matrix you're looking at right now. You nailed the call to 3,800. What is the mix you're looking at right now to go up or down on your equity call?
So look, there are a number of things that are holding us back from being, what I would call strongly bullish, and that is our panic euphoria model, our primary sentiment metric, is really exceeding levels we even saw during the bubble in 2000 in terms of, if you want to call it investor or client comfort and complacency in the market. So we are concerned about that. Valuation is certainly extended, And earnings revision momentum seems to be pulling back, possibly due to some of the recent infection outbreaks, and particularly in Europe, weakness is very evident. So those are the things that are restraining us, if you like, from being that excited. We do see, obviously, vaccines being an important dynamic to kind of get us out of the hole we're in and put an end to this very tragic experience. Here's the rub. I mean, markets and earnings are going to, or I should say, markets will benefit from the earnings growth, but markets usually reflect it about 9 months in advance. So we pulled forward some of the strength in the earnings story for 2021 into the market in 2020, particularly the last 3 months.
Well, you said valuation is certainly extended to bias. Is it extended everywhere, or is it sort of relegated to certain pockets, big tech, other areas, and you see sort of small caps, which is the consensus bet right now, still with value?
So two things, Lisa. One, we do see somewhat of a rotation. If you kind of go back and think about traditional economic slowdowns, what investors would do would be they'd go and buy utility stocks, they buy defenses in the form of consumer staples, healthcare. The way I define it is almost you need to pay for electricity, you need to eat food, and then you need the statins to control the cholesterol that you get from eating that kind of food. And that stuff is necessary. You don't need to go out and buy a new car. You don't need to go out and buy new clothing. So that's the typical defensiveness. What we saw in 2020 was the defensiveness went to mega cap tech names that had e-commerce, if you like, disruption and taking share from incumbents. They could grow, and they had defensive balance sheets in the sense of, low debt and lots of free cash flow generation. So the traditional way of thinking about the market, cyclicals, defensives, growth, value, large cap, small cap, all kind of combined into the same trade. And as you get closer to real reopening of the economy, and you and I having the comfort to go out and do things because we've been inoculated, that you should start to move away from that. And therefore, it's more likely that the value rotation, small cap rotation, and the cyclical rotation would continue, but investors are still fighting that. Now, last point on that, if you lose the big huskies, the big tech dogs, and you have to replace them with what I call the Cocker Spaniels, Poodles, and Chihuahuas, it's a lot harder to pull the dog sled or the broad market.
So, Tobias, let's talk about the sequencing just a little bit more. Once the vaccines became reality in early November, we saw that squeeze, that rotation really start to lift off. I think small caps are up by about 40% since then, from the end of October, start of November, through to where we are right now. Can you make a cycle call? Are you willing to make that kind of call right now, Tobias? The big winners of the last bull market, what the big winners of this bull market, the beginning of this recovery might look like?
I think for 2021 we can. Beyond that, it gets a little harder in the sense there's just such easy comparisons for the cyclical type names or the value type names, given the pandemic impact last year. On the other hand, the momentum of these really big, powerful tech behemoths is going to slow just because, again, some very, very difficult base effects as you move into kind of March, April, May. I think later in the year, will there be too much of expectations for that cyclical recovery that there might be some disappointment? And it's really a question. Markets aren't necessarily about outcomes. They're about outcomes relative to expectations. So kind of second half, maybe we get a little bit more or some rotation back towards growth. But I think it's a little early to make the call today.
Tobias, part of your gift is you were a sell-side analyst. You were really down in the minutia. Do you have an abiding belief that corporate officers can adapt to the cards they're dealt in the next 4 years? Are they malleable enough to keep their earnings and their margins going?
I think they are, but they're also concerned about what they may hear from Washington in terms of potential tax increases, in terms of regulatory framework. Under the Trump administration, you could say it was laissez-faire on steroids, and under the Biden administration, it's going to be not necessarily non-laissez-faire, but it'll be different than what they've experienced the past 4 years. Are they malleable, adaptable? They have been. Look at what corporate America has done even in the last 10 months in addressing and dealing with the pandemic. And I think we're all kind of fascinated how technology has allowed us to function in ways that we would not have deemed possible 10 years ago.
Tobias, great to catch up, as always. Tobias Lefkovich there of Citi. If you do get in touch with Tobias anytime soon, don't ask him when he's going to raise his price target. I'm sure he's sick to death of hearing that question over the last several months. And for many people, when these price targets were made, Tom, if you take Barry Bannister over at Stifel, just after the election, he said 6-month call, 3,800. We got there in 3 months. That's how quickly this market moved after the election when the vaccine news came through.
I actually looked at the log slopes today, John, and of course, NASDAQ 100, we all know, is a true moonshot, but it's amazing the small cap leap, John, while you were away on sabbatical. It has just been an out-of-body condition. I haven't gone back 30, 40 years to look at that perspective. Not the sabbatical, the move in the small cap stocks. But, John...
I'm just amazed that you waited 25 minutes
well, I
to
did
mention
it
the sabbatical.
for President Biden. I did it for President Biden. You know, I wanted to give you a break.
It must be quite
well.
a day for you, Tom.
You know, well,
you must be overwhelmed by tradition down in Washington to hold back for 25 minutes.
Ask not what you can
City,
do for your
alongside
sabbatical,
Tom Keene
but ask what you can do.
And Lisa Abramowitz. I'm Jonathan Ferro, tolerating Tom Keene for the next 4 years, maybe.
And then we'll get reelected.
It's Bloomberg.
Continues to be, recovering well. And with the opening up that was decided at the last 5-year plan, that is a golden opportunity for many international banks.
So we'll look to double our footprint across IB and also wealth management and asset management in the 3 to 5 year time frame.
Growth outlook structurally is very strong. But it does need to consolidate and allow time to help the share price appreciation to move more in sync with the growth.
So China can avoid further decoupling if they stop these inappropriate actions.
But at the moment, we really want to see the dust settle first on international relationships, on China's role in the global economy.
I don't see a likelihood of a big change in the policy with the change of administrations.
Our generation's biggest problem.
Climate change is happening.
And the world's most innovative solutions.
Transport, industry, buildings, electricity, all of those things.
Everything you need to know about our changing environment, the politics of global warming.
We can and we will deal with climate change.
In the fight against climate change, Bloomberg Green has you covered.
I think what we've seen during this period of time is that communicating via video is not a fad. We are using it in all aspects of our lives, for work, for learning, for communicating, for staying in touch.
from New York City for our audience worldwide. Good morning to you all. Alongside Tom Keene and Lisa Bravitz, I'm Jonathan Ferro on this inauguration day in the United States of America. Here's your price action. The equity market up 13 on the S&P 500. We advance 1/3%. In the bond market, Treasury yields just a little bit higher, Tom. There are some big banks on Wall Street that would quite like to see those yields creep a little bit higher.
Yeah, there's no question about it, with a lift and a risk-on feel, and part of that risk-on is asset appreciation at the banks. When you sub out the segments of the banks and they see their equity markets lift, and you do that with Morgan Stanley. They released now Sonali Basak on top of the Gorman story. Sonali, what do you have this morning?
So far, we have pretty good numbers here in the biggest divisions of Morgan Stanley. We have equities trading beating expectations, $2.5 billion. By comparison, that was $1.9 billion over at JP Morgan. A beat there. We have a beat in fixed income trading, showing some market share gains as well, Tom. They are light on something. They are light on their pre-tax wealth management margins, which always tends to soak in a little bit later than those investment banking investors.
We've got the pandemic results, Sonali, and then we've got the return to normalization, hopefully, later this year. How's the bank set up for that?
The bank is set up pretty well because now they own E-Trade as well, right? So they are firing on all cylinders when it comes to their wealth management unit, when it comes to their retail customer, but also when it comes to that big Wall Street customer. They ended very close last year to Goldman Sachs when it came to merger underwriting, when it came to IPOs. So long as all of that activity, John, keeps on churning, they will do all right.
Sonali, we've had this huge rivalry historically between Morgan Stanley and Goldman Sachs because they've had a similar type of profile. It seems like Morgan Stanley, contrary to Goldman Sachs, actually beat on debt trading. They also beat on EPS. They also beat on equity trading. We're seeing their shares up almost 3% now, more than 3% ahead of the open. What will people be saying when it comes to this rivalry of Morgan Stanley versus Goldman Sachs in the wake of these fourth quarter results?
Well, just check it out in the market value, Lisa. First of all, you have the stock rising of Morgan Stanley at a time where Morgan Stanley has already surpassed Goldman Sachs in market value, right? So we know that they are the #1 equities trading shop on Wall Street. They have been for a while now. JP Morgan would love to take that share. They outperformed there. Fixed income as well. Remember, 3 banks in a row, Citigroup, Bank of America, Goldman Sachs was short of expectations on fixed income trading, and we're watching Morgan Stanley step in here today with a beat.
Yeah, and I see the 14% return on equity. We'll get a compare and contrast on that in a bit. I want to go right now to what Mr. Gorman says in his statement, Chanel, and he talks about significant momentum into 2021. Is that boilerplate standard CEO blather, or is that true?
I like hearing it from James Gorman because in the middle of last year, he was a little toned down. He was a little worried about all these hiccups we're seeing in the economy, and this was coming from somebody whose top researchers were saying we would see a V shape, right? So he was optimistic. He changed his tone. He looks like he's back again.
The heart of the matter, folks, and this is for New York City and global Wall Street, and Chanel's completely focused on this as well. Corbett out, Fraser in, and Fraser wants to do what Gorman's doing. She said, we're going to do clear, we're going to do wealth management. What is the Gorman pixie dust that allows for him to be the guy that owns wealth management across the industry?
You know, one of the things we asked him last year is as he grows, he did 2 major acquisitions last year, right? Is he trying to be all things to all people? He said, no, he's trying to focus on what he does best. That wealth management arm, Tom, is not all over the world. He is not trying to be Credit Suisse abroad.
He's not trying to be BlackRock.
Exactly. He's not trying to be BlackRock, although he would like to see that asset management division grow more, but not with low-fee products, right? With private equity, with higher quality products, and not just a bunch of index funds inside of Morgan Stanley.
You know, Lisa, I hate to keep beating the same drum, but just to hear the commentary from some of these banks. Today it's Morgan Stanley and Mr. Gorman, the CEO, talking about significant momentum into a new year. Yesterday, it was Bank of America talking about the bank being a healthier bank now than they were before the pandemic in many ways. And I know it's in the numbers and in the detail, but in many ways, it's like this pandemic, this shock never happened on Wall Street.
Yeah, and this is actually one concern, and that's exactly where I wanted to go, Sonali, with you, which is how awkward is it for these banks to be reporting incredible earnings, incredible revenues, record profits in some particular cases at a time of such carnage in the economy, at a time when 9.8 million Americans are out of payrolls versus the pre-pandemic peak?
Well, it's about to get more awkward, Lisa, because these folks are about to get their bonuses too, which are going to be higher for the best performers, right? They're going to look pretty good. And so you have people that are able to perform, able to rake in significant profitability. But again, there are going to be major questions in the Yellen era about how much these banks are reaching Main Street.
10 seconds. I don't want to pin you down. Who won the bank derby this time around?
Wow.
Come
on what measure?
JP Morgan.
JP Morgan.
I'm not allowed to be biased here.
Abramowitz
I'm staying out of that one.
Shelley Bassick will stay out of it. But Elisa Abramowitz will weigh in, John.
I mean, come on.
And say JP
of course,
Morgan
they're the
as
biggest,
well.
and they absolutely consolidated market share and beat across the board. John, do you disagree?
I'm just sitting here spectating. That's the beauty of being
No, but
away from you.
John, we're going to stop. We got to stop the show right now.
Have I ever offered an opinion on anything?
Yes, you have.
John, the only
I sit on the
opinion.
sidelines. Come on. I don't like to editorialize.
For those on radio, the only opinion we've got is over the vase that's behind John. People are loving the vase and the remote. John, for radio and television right now, I want you to expand on what is clearly obvious, which is the stimulus of the last, say, 18 months, and certainly post-pandemic, has really benefited Wall Street. John, would you extend that to London Wall Street as well?
I think in many ways for the big banks, particularly on the consumer side of things, Tom, and the business side of things, it's pretty clear that the stimulus helped offset the pain that these banks would have experienced. If you just look at home loans, for instance, how many people lost their jobs last year? How many people carried on paying their bills? The banks helped with that. Let's be clear. The banks got out in front of that and said, look, we'll give you some repayment holidays. But for many of these companies that would have gone bankrupt, they didn't. For many of these individuals that might not have been able to pay their bills, they could, largely because of fiscal policy. Fiscal policy really helped these banks out in a major way. And the Federal Reserve did as well. And I think the Federal Reserve's in many ways learned the lessons of the last crisis, that we didn't have to have the credit defaults that we had, that they could step in. And we talked a lot about building that bridge to the other side. Look, I know that we've still got some damage to work through here, and this pandemic is far from over still. But if you think about the bridge that fiscal policymakers did build and the effort that the Fed put into this, I'm not saying there's no downside to this. There is. I'm just saying that it was a very effective bridge, and it helped these banks make a lot of money in a difficult time.
Well, we will see. John Farrow, Lisa Abramowitz, and Tom King, we're waiting on the inauguration. In 20 minutes scheduled, the President of the United States will leave for Joint Andrews on the helicopter as well on his way to Florida. Right now, not enough time, but we want to get him in. Terry Weissman joins us with Macquarie and their Global Director of Currency and Interest Rates. Terry, it is a day of inauguration. Is it a day of change? Is it a day, and within all the policy prescriptions you've observed, that will change the direction of the U.S. dollar?
Yes, I think there are certain things that the new administration is going to do that could affect the dollar. Let's not say so much the dollar, but rather other currencies, if you will. Let's take the flip side of it. China is going to become a focus or be a focus of this new administration. We saw that evident with Janet Yellen's testimony before the Senate yesterday, in that there was quite a lot of Trumpianism in her discussion, especially with regard to the prospect that the Biden administration will still be strident in its approach to China and China's infringements on what the U.S. still sees to be its various inalienable rights, including intellectual property and other issues in which China has been seen to be transgressing. And that's not saying that there are going to be new tariffs placed on Chinese imports into the U.S., but it does look like the current tariff situation will maintain, and we may see sanctions imposed on Chinese companies. So could that affect the relationship between the dollar and the yuan over time? Absolutely it can. If these get too strong, we could see ultimately dollar yuan drift back higher.
Yeah.
Other areas that could of policy from the Biden administration that could affect foreign currencies. Canada is obviously a bit in the crosshairs here. You see with the revocation of the permits for the Keystone XL pipeline, that could ultimately over time impair the balance of payments for Canada, because it'll impair their ability to export oil. And let's even take another emerging market, Brazil. Biden is not going to be a friend of Jair Bolsonaro's in Brazil. Contention over environmental policy in Brazil could make U.S. investment in Brazil and European investment in Brazil ultimately come down, and that could impair the Brazilian real. So there's just three cases there where a shift in policy or continuation of policy, if you will, in the case of China, can hurt other currencies, potentially benefit the dollar in regard to those currencies at least.
Terry, we've got to leave it there. Terry Wiseman, always great to get you on the program. Sorry it's so short. We have to get you back again soon. FX is getting a little bit interesting, guys, and I hate to get cute about it, but just to pick up on one currency pair, what's happening with euro sterling is getting a lot of attention.
Yeah.
And it's not a Brexit story. We don't even have to talk about Brexit. Tom, it's a vaccination story. I think a vaccination trade starting to emerge within G10, the euro versus sterling outperforming, because the vaccination effort in the UK, at least so far, has been a lot more effective than what we've seen play out on the continent.
It'll be interesting to see, John, also in the United States, and a bit bittersweet for President Trump, it would be something to see the vaccines just in this week and next week pick up as President Trump leaves the White House. You wonder what that dynamic is in the United States as well.
Lisa, it's something we all want to see. The vaccination program really ramp up, and then you get the fiscal effort come in at just the right time, and then you start to lift off. And I go back to a theme we touched on yesterday, and I think it's one that we'll continue talking about for the months and quarters to come as well. Just that outperformance of the United States back on the table versus Europe, which is stumbling. Let's be clear about that.
Well, which raises a question of what actually is the main driver of currency strength. Is it the idea of tighter financial policy, tighter fiscal monetary policy, or is it just sheer growth, sheer success when it comes to vaccination? And this is the conundrum, because a lot of people have been arguing that as the U.S. goes further into debt, that will lead to a weaker dollar. Is that really the case, John?
We'll see. From New York City, for our audience worldwide, alongside Lisa Brabbits and Tom Keene, I'm Jonathan Ferro. Inauguration Day down in Washington, D.C. For the United States of America, Joe Biden will become the next president. This is Bloomberg.
With the First Word News, I'm Emma Chandra. The incoming President of the United States will start reversing some of his predecessor's policies almost immediately. Not long after he's sworn in, Joe Biden will take at least 15 executive actions. They'll unwind President Trump's moves to take the U.S. out of the Paris Agreement and the World Health Organization. Construction on a border wall would also be halted, and the permit for the controversial Keystone XL pipeline would be revoked. Meanwhile, Joe Biden's cabinet picks are signaling that the new administration will maintain President Trump's tough line toward China. Officials are vowing to fight what they called abusive trade practices. Plus, they said they would bar products from the Chinese region home to ethnic Uyghur Muslims. Beijing has been accused of genocide involving the Uyghurs. President Trump has pardoned his former strategist Steve Bannon. Bannon's been charged with defrauding thousands of investors who believed their money would go to build a wall along the southern border. Prosecutors say he diverted $1 million of the fund. The president also pardoned and commuted the sentences of dozens of others, including rapper Lil Wayne, and who pleaded guilty to a federal gun charge last year. President Trump reportedly has discussed starting a new political party. According to Dow Jones, he'd like to call it the Patriot Party. In recent days, the president has feuded with several Republican leaders. Polls show that he retains strong support among rank-and-file Republicans. Shares of Alibaba jumped after co-founder Jack Ma reappeared. Ma hadn't been seen since China's government began clamping down on his business empire almost 3 months ago. He spoke briefly during an annual event he hosts to recognize rural teachers. Global news 24 hours a day on air and on Bloomberg Quick Take, powered by more than 2,700 journalists. This is...
This is Bloomberg Best, your weekly review of the most important business news, analysis, and interviews from Bloomberg Television around the world.
Ken Burns, welcome to Bloomberg Big Decisions.
We have always been a mixture of things. We are always stronger for that mixture.
Growth is a way to stay competitive, delight more and more consumers.
Are you worried that people won't take the vaccine?
We remain concerned about vaccine hesitancy.
What is one word of advice you'll take with you?
Learn how to listen. And that is certainly something that has served me well.
Ankiti, where do you go from here?
It's a huge market. It's a huge opportunity. I want to go 100x from here.
Our philosophy is to partner where we can and stand apart when we should.
The trends, investments, and competition of the European ETF industry. Join us on Bloomberg ETF IQ Europe.
I am David Weston. Bloomberg Television is reinventing one of the most iconic brands in financial television for a new audience. Join me to see the news program for the clever investor. This is Bloomberg Wall Street Week.
Time the Senate convened, we had just reclaimed the Capitol from violent criminals. The mob was fed lies. They were provoked by the president and other powerful people. But we pressed on. We stood together and said an angry mob would not get veto power over the rule of law in our nation. President-elect Biden and Vice President-elect Harris will be sworn in. We'll have a safe and successful inaugural right here on the west front of the Capitol.
Senator Mitch McConnell not holding back what he thinks of the events of the last couple of weeks as we approach inauguration afternoon in the United States of America. From New York City this morning, alongside Tom Keene and Lisa Bravitz, I'm Jonathan Ferro. Want to touch in and touch base with the equity market this morning, and not just the broad index story as we breached 3,800 briefly in yesterday's session. On equity futures this morning, we are through that level, up about 1/3 of 1%, but the standout mover of the morning, and let's be clear about this, if we weren't so focused on Washington, D.C., we probably would have started the program with what's happened over at Netflix. Tom, the turnaround of that story is remarkable. And what makes it more remarkable is that they're doing it with big competitors in the market as well, with Disney Plus making its entrance in the last year or so.
Well, they are, John. And what is so important here is we've seen this act before, but here it's a creative act. Comcast made the flip from a huge capital expense over to developing free cash flow, but they didn't have to come up with a Queen's Gambit every 12 months or whatever the calculation is. John, I'm fascinated by trying to make that accounting shift, that strategic shift within a creative milieu. To me, it's really hard.
Lisa, that shift away from debt-fueled growth, I have no idea if it's a permanent shift away from debt-fueled growth, but it's a shift many people didn't think would ever happen.
Yeah, people thought that they were going to burn through cash and then crash and burn. The interesting thing is they've actually, John, been able to raise prices here, even though they have adapted more content and they do have more competitors. Tom, what are you watching? The Dig? Is that what you've been watching?
I'm going to watch it. It's on, John. They were there out in Pharaoh's backyard at the end of World War II, digging up a boat in a hunk of dirt. It's all in the British Museum right now. Micklethwaite briefed me on this. Our editor-in-chief who knows all about Sutton, who whatever it is. Right now in politics, and this is a really important interview for those looking forward past this inauguration. Whit Ayers is with North Star Opinion Research, and he provides wisdom and counsel to a GOP shell-shocked. He joins us this morning on the path forward for Senator McConnell and the rest of the GOP. Whit, I am absolutely fascinated about what Marco Rubio does. He's a really interesting guy. His parents were not U.S. citizens when he was born. He's not fabulously wealthy and all that. Within your polling, how does Marco Rubio pick up the pieces after the Trump administration?
Well, that's a really good question. The GOP is now seriously split between the governing wing and the populist wing. The governing wing has been dominant for a long time and still is dominant among elected officials. The populist wing was there before Donald Trump, think Tea Party in 2010. But Donald Trump really grew it and expanded it and made it into a dominant force in Republican primaries, although it never got majority support in the country. So the real question now is whether the GOP splits or whether it can maintain an uneasy alliance. Marco Rubio is trying to figure out, with his common good capitalism, how to appeal to both of those factions of the party. But it remains to be seen how successful he will be with that effort.
Whit, is this still a majority conservative country?
It is still a majority center-right country. If you ask most people where they stand, they are moderate, somewhat conservative, or conservative. But it's not a far-right country, and that's part of the problem for the populist wing.
So there are some reports that President Trump is going to start his own political party. What would that do to the Republicans?
It would split the Republicans. I don't think there's any question about that. And it would make it far easier for the Democrats to win a lot of elections and gain even stronger control over the federal government.
Whit, I look at how they approach 2022. And last week, I'm sure it's a question you're getting now from all these GOP heavyweights. Can money help them win in the primary against such a populist force?
It would be difficult to say that money alone can help win a primary. I think that you're going to have somebody who has the charisma and the talent to be able to marry those two forces together. But if the populist force dominates the primaries, you're going to get a lot more QAnon people like Marjorie Taylor Greene winning primaries, which in a lot of districts will make it more difficult for them to win a general election against a good Democrat.
Where do you think the centre-right proposal for the heartlands, for the working class in the United States is going to come from? In the United Kingdom in the previous election, it's clear that the Conservative message in the United Kingdom, the centre-right message, is still an attractive message for many people, including traditionally where the Labour Party dominated in the north of the country. I just refuse to believe that in the United States of America that a centre-right message wouldn't be attractive still. And to your point, it's still a majority centre-right country. Who can stop the left from maintaining a monopoly on the moral high ground and what is good for the white working class? Who can achieve that?
Well, we're going to have a contest to see who can achieve that, and there will be many, many Republicans that will make that effort. There is no question that the Republican Party and the government in general is going to have to offer more hope to blue-collar communities that have been ravaged by coronavirus, ravaged by an opioid epidemic, that have seen many of their manufacturing jobs go overseas. The party has to have a better and more compelling message of hope for those people, for the blue-collar folks to continue to be in the Republican Party rather than go back to the Democratic Party where they began.
Well, it's great to catch up with you, sir. Whit Ayers of North Star Opinion Research is going to be sticking with us as we work our way through some of the events taking place down in Washington, D.C. Tom Keene, number 45, will have his own exit. President Donald Trump, number 46, will have his inauguration in around about 2 hours' time. 4 hours' time.
John, I'll tell you, it is so strange to see on the south lawn of the White House. This is directly west of where Emily Wilkins is, with a red carpet out for the president, and I assume the first lady traveling with him. Maybe we'll see various offspring as well. The helicopter awaits the president of the United States on a perfect January morning. John? John?
Tom, I assumed you'd have more to say. Bear in mind that I can't see the pictures, Tom.
I did not know that. I did not know that.
So I thought you'd talk us
I'm
through
so
the pictures
sorry,
just a little bit more.
I thought that your entourage had demanded that you have a full remote setup with a 48-inch screen.
I'd love to. I've just got some bright lights and a camera.
Well, we will see now. We see now that the helicopter's on the lawn, and Lisa, I know you can see these images with the helicopter winding down. Yeah, I would think, Lisa, we'll get some punctuality today from the president on the timing. And the president, Lisa, and Mr. Biden, they really overlap for the next 2 or 3 hours.
Yeah, and that was, some people said by design. There was some discussion of a parade or some sort of elaborate send-off of President Trump nearer to the time of the inauguration. We're talking about unity, and that's how the theme is going to be of Joe Biden's speech around 12 p.m. And I guess my question is, what is the tone that President Trump is going to strike for his supporters? Is he going to try to edify this message of unity, or is he going to raise questions, Tom, about the legitimacy of the vote, about the his support or lack thereof of the people who were the insurrectionists a couple weeks ago? These are key points as we try to come with some charted path forward, Tom.
We welcome all of you on Bloomberg Radio and Bloomberg Television, and for radio on a perfect January morning in Washington. The helicopter, Marine One, sitting at the south lawn of the White House, not too far from that door that we have seen so many events take place. And I would note a small crowd attending at the White House. Of course, it has been depeopled, as all White Houses are, over the last number of days. A travel to Andrews and then on to Florida, and within those events, some form of comments by President Trump scheduled at Andrews, and we'll have to see what those comments lead. Emily Wilkins joining us now, our Bloomberg government reporter, just east of these events at Freedom Plaza, looking down Pennsylvania Avenue to the Capitol. Emily, Trump and Biden will overlap here for the next 2 or 3 hours. What will you be watching for?
So there might overlap technically in D.C., but these both gentlemen are going to be on very different tracks for the day. Trump's about to leave to go to Joint Base Andrews, where he's expected to give a short speech. Biden, on the other hand, will attend a mass earlier today. He will be accompanied by leaders of the Senate, both Democrats and Republicans, before we get on to the inaugural, what festivities do remain for today.
Emily, let's talk about policy, because we will be getting policy changes through today as well. What have you got your eye on?
We have our eye on the executive orders that newly sworn in President Biden is expected to be signing. We've got at least 15 orders today. They span a wide range. They include ending construction on the border wall in Mexico. They include expanding the eviction moratorium, keeping interest off student loan debts, a couple things that we've already seen going on with the coronavirus, and a couple more policy changes.
How much teeth do these executive orders have at the outset?
They have the teeth that are needed to get the things done. I mean, we are going to be seeing some bigger policies that will need to go through Congress, things like more coronavirus funding, major changes with immigration, tax reform. But for a lot of these things, this was stuff that the Trump administration did with the stroke of a pen, and it's stuff that the Biden administration can also revoke with the stroke of a pen.
Emily, within the speech, Mr. Biden has stated through an aide this morning, I'm going to give credit to CNN on that, I'm not sure of that, but I'll guess, that he will not mention the former president. He must address Republicans on your Capitol Hill. What would you expect to hear from President Biden on the unity he desires to those Republicans?
I think Biden will talk about some themes that we've already heard him touch on, being a president for all Americans, including Americans who did not go ahead and vote for him. And Biden has made it very clear that he wants the support and cooperation for Republicans in Congress. He does not want to have to push through things on party line votes, although whether or not that actually happens remains to be seen in the coming weeks.
Emily, 70 million plus Americans did not vote for Joe Biden, who is about to become the president of the United States. And I'm always fascinated by this word unity. This word unity, and whether it's just lip service because it's the right thing to say. I think the last couple of weeks proved that it's a whole lot more than that. But for it to be effective, you've got to get that 70 million plus Americans to come along with you. What's the message for them today?
I think we've got two different messages here. I mean, number one, the one about talking about unity, about sort of offering that olive branch, talking about being a president for all Americans. I mean, I know that we're hearing these themes over and over again, but they weren't themes that we heard a lot from the Trump administration. And so hearing them, Biden, say them again and again and again, it's kind of agenda setting from the top in a way. The message coming from the top is one of unity. And the other one, as far as directing a path forward, talking about policy and trying to make sure that the way they're explaining those policies as positive for a wide swath of Americans.
As we look at the helicopter awaiting President Trump and the First Lady, Lady Melania Trump, there's questions about President Trump's future. There were discussions that perhaps he would start his own political party. What color do we have on that, Emily?
I think at this point, you kind of have to look to the voters and those voters who support President Trump. A number of them who I've spoken to have said that they are Trump supporters first before they belong to any party. And so the question is, number one, how will those voters continue to support Trump as he loses his platform as president in the White House? And number two, how will that impact elections? Will we see lawmakers still want to be in step with Trump as we saw for the recent Georgia Senate runoffs? Will we see the party continue to listen to Trump, to pay attention to Trump? Or will we see other figures begin to emerge and lead the party in a different direction?
Emily Wilkins, just east of the White House here. We welcome all of you to our simulcast on Bloomberg Radio and Bloomberg Television here at the 8 o'clock hour. Futures up 15, Dow futures up 40, a lift to the market on a day of history for the United States of America. Jonathan Farrow, Lisa Abramowitz, and Tom Keene, thank you for joining us through the day. David Weston at 11 a.m. will move to the swearing in of President Biden. Right now, the helicopter on the south lawn of the White House. And John Farrell, I want to direct our attention to what we'll see in half an hour, which is Mr. and Mrs. Biden coming out of Blair House, where traditionally they would stay, and going and beginning the festivities of the day, the celebration of the day. I mean, it's odd in that it's one part a unique process by President Trump, and another part, John Farrell, of Mr. Biden really hearkening to great tradition.
And Tom, tradition is one thing, but policymaking is another. And I think the tradition is, of course, important. But this year, you're walking into a real crisis, Tom. A real crisis, a pandemic that continues to take many people's lives, and a threshold in the United States of America that went through 400,000 in the last 24 hours. There is real work to do. There is no honeymoon down in Washington, D.C. Let's be clear about that. I think the events of the last 2 weeks prove that, underline it. And Tom, I think the way that transfer of power will take place today through the next several hours of the United States of America underlines that these are not normal times. There's nothing normal about it. There's real work to do still, and they're going to have to hit the ground running. And I don't think they get 100 days. I don't think they get 100 days to sit there and wait, and I don't think they expect they will either. They've been talking about the failures of this administration since this administration walked into the White House, and people will want to see results and see results quickly. And the vaccination program will be a real test of that. How quickly can things improve? They're okay. They're pretty good compared to the rest of the world right now on the vaccination front, Tom. It needs to get a whole lot better.
Now, glimmers here in the last few days of maybe some better trends in the United States. But as I said earlier, a few days ago, I did an extrapolation out to the shocking statistic of 500,000, and it's unfortunately sooner rather than later. The schedule here for this hour, and thank to our producers for giving us this, and this is already amended. The president at 8 o'clock to Andrews. We are late on that at 8:04 Wall Street time. 8:20, the president with comments at Andrews. Mr. Biden leaving Blair House at 8:30. I assume that'll be on schedule. And he will attend church, a bipartisan effort. It's St. Matthew's Catholic Church, the cathedral of the Catholic Church in Washington, D.C. Right now, Greg Valliere joins us with AFG. I'll note that everybody in Washington reads each and every morning. And Greg, I do want to talk about something we've really avoided this morning. As John Farrell mentions, we get right to work. And part of that work is impeachment. What will we see this Wednesday and Thursday on impeachment? Wednesday and Thursday on impeachment.
Yeah, hi, Tom. Good morning. You know, everybody talks about unity, and I know it's going to be a big theme for Joe Biden, but we have an impeachment trial coming up that I think will be bitter. I think it'll drag on for 2 or 3 weeks. I think they probably will fail. I think it could make Donald Trump look like a martyr. I think it'll complicate Joe Biden's agenda. So right away, after talking about unity, we get that. And I would just also add, Tom, the Janet Yellen hearing yesterday was not that unified. The Republicans pushed back hard on new spending.
Yeah, well, that's exactly where I wanted to go, this idea that we talk about unity and yet we have these divisions that are getting just deeper. Do you feel momentum behind this $1.9 trillion plan, or do you think this is going to drag out for months, far longer than the market is pricing in?
I think there's momentum behind a plan. I'm not sure it's this plan that has a lot of money for state and local governments, for minimum wage. I think we'll get something, but I don't think it'll be $1.9 trillion. I think we could get a deal by the end of February, but the Republicans really showed their hand yesterday that they don't want anything this expensive.
1.9 trillion is the number. What do you think it comes down to, Greg?
Well, I've been saying something around 1.5. I think maybe 1.4, 1.5. I think that is doable. The Democrats have to hold on to every one of their 50 senators, and I'm not convinced, John, that they've got all 50. They might have 48. They might have 49. So this will, I think, boil down to negotiations between Joe Biden and Mitch McConnell.
Greg Valliere with us with AGF, and he will stay with us at this moment. Kevin Cirilli at the Capitol, overlooking the west front of the Capitol. Emily Wilkins just east of the White House at Freedom Plaza as we await the President of the United States to leave, now 7 minutes behind schedule. Not a surprise with that. The helicopter awaits for the trip to Andrews as well. Greg Valliere, so much of this, and we just talked to Whit Ayers, the pollster for conservative at Republicans, is Republicans acting fast to get ready for 2022 primaries. What would you expect to see from conservative Southern Republicans?
Well, it is amazing, isn't it, Tom, that we're already talking about 2022, yes. But that's Washington. So a couple of points I'd make. Number one, I do think that the Republicans will hit hard on the issue of taxes and spending. I think the country doesn't want big new taxes. I think that's going to be a potent argument for them. So I think that the other point I'd make is that historically a first-term president in his first midterm election loses about 5% of House and Senate seats. If Biden were to lose 5% of House and Senate seats, he'd lose both houses.
Greg, I want you to talk about the silence of Mr. Hoover and Mr. Roosevelt long ago and far away in the early days of the Depression. Without question, the quietest car ride in the history of our presidents. With all your perspective, Greg Valliere, is Mr. Trump setting precedents here that we may see in the future? Or in your opinion, is this a one-off of discord?
I think it's a one-off. I think most politicians, right or left, respect tradition. You know, Trump doesn't. He stirred the pot. I mean, that's Donald Trump. He didn't respect a lot of the norms. But I think as we go into other elections, there will be more conciliation.
Greg, when we talk about the presidency of Trump, it was one that was anti-establishment. It was anti-Washington. That was the goal of his, taking out some of the career members of the cabinet, of the various departments, and putting in his own people. What do you think the legacy of that will be as Joe Biden comes in and tries to reverse that?
Well, you know, it's one thing to blow things up. I get it that there are certain institutions that haven't worked well and you want to blow them up, but you have to have something to replace them with. And he would blow things up without any alternative, and I think that got tiresome. I also think the level of personal rancor, the vindictiveness, the ugliness of his tweets really distinguished him and really diminished his cause.
John, I think the British do this better. You lose the election, what do? You leave in like 3 hours with a set of cardboard boxes.
You move out the next day. You move out the next day. And I do think the events of the last few months, Tom, really exposed some vulnerability in that process, a process, of course, established for good reason many years ago. But I wonder, Greg, just as a final question to you, sir, whether that's something that people will rethink, will need to rethink, whether you think we should rethink that.
Well, I think there were things that Trump did that were positive. Getting tough with China, I think everybody would agree on. I think having fewer regulations, people would agree on. It was the way he did it. The way he did it was so over the top and outrageous that it hurt his cause.
Greg Valliere, thank you so much for joining us on the day of inauguration. And to all of us, thank you for your perspective across this historic campaign. Kevin Cirilli is at the Capitol. Kevin, the sun rises on your Capitol. A delicate question. Is the Capitol still scarred from the protest and riot of January 6th, or is it spanking new and perfect?
You know, that's a great question. No, it's actually completely recovered. And in walking here through where the massacre occurred, I mean, everything's seemingly back to normal, albeit from a structural standpoint. They've started the music recordings behind me, where, again, in just a couple of hours, the inauguration is set to begin. I was struck by some of the policies that President-elect Biden is going to issue through executive order, and I thought Greg did a great job there explaining some of them. I want to touch into the geopolitics, because on the issue of the Iran nuclear disarmament deal, yesterday Tony Blinken, before the Senate, really forecasting that they are not going to take immediate action on China or in terms of a re-engagement on the Iran nuclear disarmament deal. But today is all about the pomp and circumstances, even if it is somewhat different than in inaugurations past. Tom, I can't stress this enough. Where I'm positioned on the west side of the Capitol, where the attack took place, President Biden will be speaking on that podium behind me. He's going to be overlooking a mall with flags, thousands of flags, to honor those who have lost their lives from COVID-19. Typically, he would be looking out at thousands of people, talking to supporters and Americans who come to the city for the passing of the democracy torch, so to speak. But clearly a very different inauguration, unprecedented in terms of what we've ever seen here in this country.
Kevin, a lot in there from national to international. When you look at the international aspects here, when you talk about the executive orders, not only do you have the expected re-entry into the Iranian nuclear deal, but you also have an attempt to re-enter the Paris Climate Accord. How much will allies of the United States reopen these negotiations to the nation after the last 4 years?
Significantly, especially as it relates to Europe, right? I mean, when you look at who the Blinken team has assembled, and even likely Treasury Secretary Yellen's team that she has assembled from the Obama years, Wally Adeyemo, one of the top deputies from the Obama administration, joining Yellen's team. This is a team from the Obama era as they look for a pragmatic approach to multilateralism. But on the issue of tariffs, Lisa, as you just alluded to, I mean, this is a significant departure from the Obama years in terms of the economic landscape and the forecast. So when the Biden administration is talking about a $1.9 trillion stimulus plan, they're going to have to do so in a geopolitical setting where, quite frankly, Europe is also struggling, and there's been a tariff for tariff back and forth. So it complicates the matters. But domestically, beyond that, I would note that Republicans and Democrats are in agreement on Iran in the sense that they don't want Iran having a nuclear weapon. Republicans and Democrats are in agreement on China in the sense that they would like to better protect America from China. So they're working toward the same goal.
Kevin, stay with us, please. I want to talk to you about Mr. Biden and his plans for the next hour and through the morning as well. Right now, the President of the United States with Mrs. Trump outside the South Lawn of the White House and now walking towards the helicopter to Marine One, their final walk here on the way to Andrews. It is a perfect day in Washington. John, it's amazing how January in Washington can be so lovely.
It is beautiful, Tom, and I'm happy to be back. Unfortunately, I can't see how lovely it is, as I've told you about 15 minutes ago. I would love to return to the policy issue, Kevin, and to continue what you were talking about. When it comes to things like China, I think the status quo wasn't good enough for a lot of people in this country. The status quo, the conventional approach with China, to try and get them to change. The ultimate objective of this administration that is leaving now, with the President of the United States, Donald Trump, and the previous administration with President Obama, was to get Beijing to change, to get it to change its behavior. It didn't work with the last administration. It didn't work with that approach. Hasn't worked with this approach either. Now, many people might be happy to hear the word multilateral and a new multilateral approach, or return to a multilateral approach. This administration needs to convince Europe to stop sitting on the fence. It needs to convince Germany to do something about Russia and maybe even sacrifice its energy ties with the country. It needs to convince Germany to risk its commercial ties with China as well, to get them to push Beijing to change its behavior. And Kevin, it's unclear to me what it would actually take, and whether China has actually already achieved what it wanted to achieve, which is deeply ingrain itself in global supply chains, deeply embed itself in commercial ties where countries like Germany are just unwilling to risk it, and therefore continue to be a leech on the liberal order that they continue to take advantage of. Now, you can come in as a new administration and talk about a multilateral approach, a return to tradition, a return to conventional policy making, but we need to see results. Let's not think this is a given, that they come in, they get 4 years, and it's all going to go back to normal happy days. We need to see results. Do they actually think they can get results going back to the old ways of doing business, when the old ways of doing business didn't get results either?
They do. And I think you make a really good point in terms of the broader standpoint of even predating the Trump administration. If you go back 20, 30 years in terms of even back to Nixon's administration, in terms of the different approach that the U.S. took towards China. And now, of course, a reckoning moment for American policy, not just Republican or Democratic policy, but American policy, and taking a second look. You mentioned the inroads that China have made, but let's also look at their setbacks. They have not been able to successfully look at Australia. They have not been able successfully to forge a 5G network to the liking that they would have wanted.
Yeah.
One of the final actions that Secretary of State Mike Pompeo took yesterday was to declare genocide in China with regards to the Uyghurs. But I'm struck by this, those images of President Trump departing the White House with the First Lady en route to Mar-a-Lago, Lisa. He arrived at the White House as a nationalist, accompanied by Steve Bannon, someone whom he pardoned as one of his final acts in his administration, trying to separate the United States from the global order. But this is a return to globalism. This is more than just a return to a multilateral approach.
Yeah, indeed. And we are seeing the images of the helicopter beginning its departure for Andrews as President Trump ends his term as president. He did say that serving as president was the honor of a lifetime. You could see the helicopter propeller going here as it lifts off. Is his final moments as president of the United States. Kevin, what is President Trump going to do in the next months? How closely are people going to be watching his actions, or will he just fade into the background?
President Trump leaves the White House incredibly politically damaged. He does so still with an impeachment trial in the Senate, following remarks from the Senate Majority Leader, a Republican, Mitch McConnell, who yesterday continued to place blame for the attack on the Capitol at the hands of President Trump. He also leaves with incredible legal questions surrounding what he will be able to do moving forward. His media apparatus dismantled. His social media platform he's barred from with Twitter. This was someone who captured the attention of working class America 4 years ago and now leaves with an economy that is significantly hindered and hampered with regards to the global pandemic. He does so at a time in which the nation continues to be increasingly divided. It's unknown whether or not he will continue to harbor political ambitions. Members of his immediate family, most notably his adult children, have openly speculated about the possibility of they themselves running for office, or President Trump seeking another term several years from now. But again, he in the immediate short term is going to have to face a legal team that tries to serve as a referee, so to speak, for him to navigate through his second impeachment trial in the Senate, and this one is the outcome is increasingly unclear. I can see the helicopter flying right behind me as we hear it. A remarkable, historic moment, Tom, as President Trump flies via the helicopter over the Capitol, where just more than a week ago that attack happened, as he goes to Joint Base Andrews and then will go back to Mar-a-Lago to reside. But he is now leaving Washington, D.C. He has just now flown over the United States Capitol. The Trump era coming to a close.
Kevin Cerulli will stay with us, of course, through the morning, and we look for our coverage at 11 a.m. of a swearing-in at 12 noon. Lisa Abramowitz, Jonathan Farrow, and Tom Keene on the simulcast. We certainly welcome all of you on Bloomberg Radio as we try to describe the images for you that we see on TV, and we'll continue here. Mr. Biden expected to leave Blair House, I believe, in about 15 minutes. I'm guessing there, and of course, Mr. Trump landing at Andrews. Right now, with futures up 17 and Dow futures up 68, it is a market that is voting on prosperity for the haves, voting for the prosperity of those that participate in the markets. Alicia Levine is a wonderful student of this. She's at BNY Mellon with acute mathematics and a really, really sharp set of critical thinking skills to get us through 2021. Alicia, have you amended your view forward of the events of the last 30 days?
Yeah, good morning. Good morning, Dream Team. Your coverage has been really wonderful this morning, really enjoying it. Yes, we have. So the way we've amended it is to say that we think that for markets, the cyclical trade has legs. It's deepened, and that the name of the game is rotation here. And we think that because, as you can see, the stimulus is going to be enormous. The initial proposal put forth by the incoming Biden administration is double the size that Wall Street was really expecting. And direct checks to households are already being spent. We saw the December direct checks coming into households the first 12 days of the year on the order of $130 billion. And those people who received direct checks have already increased their credit card spending by 20% in the first week of January alone. So what does that mean? This economy is 70% consumption, and whether households are saving the checks or spending them, GDP will be going higher, and with that, the sectors that are levered to the cyclical recovery will move higher as well, and this trade will have legs.
Alicia, where is that money being spent?
So it's interesting. So the households that are spending it tend to be households that earn $50,000 or less, and it's being spent on things like clothing and food and housing. The households that are spending it tend to be the wealthier households, and that's why we think the second half of the year, when services can come back online in a more meaningful way and in a more regular way because of the dissemination of vaccine, those households right now have an extra $1.4 trillion to spend in savings, and that pent-up demand is going to meet that savings. It's going to get higher with increased checks to households. There's going to be enormous spending in this country. I think the boom is coming.
So how quickly could that spending drop off if we don't get some sort of additional fiscal stimulus passed in the upcoming 2-3 months?
So the bill that was passed in December was really meant to get us through the end of March because the unemployment benefits expire and that extra $300 a week expires at the end of March. And the checks really are of the amount to get households through the end of March. So the Biden plan is another bridge, right? And that's really to look forward, get households equalized here and how they can handle the further scourge of the pandemic getting us through into June and July. This is a lot of money, folks. It's very hard to overstate how much money is being spent on rescue here.
And this is one reason why a lot of people are expecting inflation to pick up as the year goes on. This is one of the big conundrums, though. Could it pick up quite a bit more than people had expected, pushing yields higher, pushing the Fed's hands, and frankly, torpedoing some of the most popular calls in the equity market? Do you see a growing risk of that, given the pent-up demand, the pent-up savings that you just talked about?
Yeah, hi, Lisa. This is like the question for markets this year. This is the defining question, and that's how quickly do yields rise and what does the Fed do about it? So the biggest risk to markets here is a spike in yields, not so much the gently rolling higher, but the spike. And it's very clear that inflation will look hotter simply because of calendar effects, because of base effects into the spring. So no one should get too concerned about that. What we've heard from the Fed is that they're willing for higher inflation prints in 2020 to kind of pass by. However, base effects can still seep into forward-looking inflation expectations. And so it's not just a wash, it's something to look out for. We think the risk for inflation is higher. I think the market will overlook what happens in the prints for the spring. As we move through the rest of the year, I think the risk is that inflation is higher than markets are currently expecting.
Alicia, there's definitely a lot of concern about this, and this is something that we keep hearing about, this idea of inflation picking up. How do stocks respond if you do get what you expect, which is higher than expected inflation?
So what's going to happen as bond yields move higher is that you're going to compress some of the PEs, the price-earning ratios, and that's going to really affect some of the tech trades because those are long-duration assets with high cash flowing assets. So higher yields will dent some of the PE exuberance on the tech trade, which is why we like cyclicals here. We think overall it's not going to be a dent in the market because the earnings power coming from the cyclicals should kind of overcome the lower PEs that the market is willing to pay overall. We think earnings are going higher, particularly in the second half of the year, and that earnings of recovery is going to propel markets going forward. Not so much the PEs, it's the earnings recovery.
If you're just joining us, Alicia Levine with us with BNY Mellon. We ask her to stay with us as we move forward for the hour. We have a number of images, and for those of you of radio at Andrews, we have Air Force One with the wide set of flags set up with an audience for the President of the United States. And at the same time, as we've seen with the President-elect in recent days, less flags. At Blair House, there are no flags, just the acclaimed stairway down, of course, forever sealed in the nation's memory as a point of an assassination attempt against President Truman. But the green awning down, as we have seen at Blair House, and we await Mr. Biden to move to St. Matthew's Cathedral. The symbolism of this is remarkable to see Mr. Biden move to church in a bipartisan effort at St. Matthew's Cathedral, not the National Cathedral of the Episcopal Church. John Farrell with us as well, of course, with Lisa Bramowitz. John, it's on radio, it's challenging. It is a morning of many images.
It is a morning of many images, Tom, and I think many changes about to take place as well. Just in terms of the way people conduct their jobs. For market participants, 4 years ago, you would wake up and realize, hang on a minute, my job's just changed. Policy can change, and policy can change really quickly. And it can change by a single tweet. And we weren't ready for that. I don't think many people were ready for that. 4 years later, I think, speaking to investors and market participants, there's a feeling that on Washington, just in terms of policy, that eventually the volume gets turned down. That you don't have to wake up in the middle of the night and look at Twitter to see if something's changed at the White House. That we won't get in these chaotic battles with other countries. Now, Tom, that's a change in approach. And I think the change of approach is important. But, Tom, the point I'm trying to make on policy is that the approach to policy might change. I just wonder how much the actual policy will change when it comes to issues like China specifically. And I think we've got to divorce the two issues. Policy making will go back to the traditional way of making policy. Will the policy shift radically away from what we've seen? I think in places like China, not so much.
I'll defer to the political philosopher from Austin, Texas, Darden Smith, the great songwriter. John, it's going to be about little victories, and that's what you do when it's a 50-50 Senate. That's what you do when the House is relatively precarious. I would suggest far more precarious than many people expect. We welcome all of you on Bloomberg Radio, a perfect morning in Washington, D.C., with coverage by our Emily Wilkinson and of course, Kevin Cirilli at the Capitol. At Joint Base Andrews right now, Marine One taxiing up with a slow speed with the President of the United States and Mrs. Trump as they will attend here. We are expecting some form of comments. Kevin, the president, I believe, will make comments at Andrews. We will see if we have those here in a moment. What kind of message is he sending to those that support him so much? What is the continued message of the president to those that have never given up on Donald Trump?
Yesterday, President Trump released a nearly 20-minute video in which he talked about what he believes are his accomplishments, including his record as president. So I would expect him, if he does choose to make remarks, for them to be brief. It is very rare that an outgoing president give remarks on the day of another incoming administration's inauguration. So I would expect them to be brief, as well as perhaps thanking his supporters. But again, the nature of tradition that has been broken from previous inaugurations is staggering. Typically, you would see the incoming administration and the outgoing administration do some type of walk-arounds and photo opportunity as they meet and talk about the changing of the administrations. But that is not happening. So from here, when he departs for Mar-a-Lago in Florida, then we'll start to see the images of President-elect Biden going to church with Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell, Speaker Pelosi, and others. Then you'll see them traveling to the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier. Then, of course, you will hear from people like Vice President-elect Kamala Harris in an historic speech as she becomes the nation's first female vice president, shattering a glass ceiling that has for so long has not been broken. And then, of course, we'll hear performances, including from Lady Gaga singing the national anthem, Jennifer Lopez as well, Garth Brooks representing a more country unifying image. He is a Republican, as he has talked about. And then from there, President-elect Biden, in a speech that we're told he has worked on by himself, but also with close advisors, including people like John Meacham, to deliver a unifying message at a time in which parties and polarization has never been more polarized in America.
Well, Kevin, let's talk about that. I've lost count of the amount of times you've had to say unity and unifying through this morning. It is truly a momentous occasion. It is truly bizarre. Let's think about it. Over the last 4 years, I know we've become desensitized to things happening down in D.C., and the bar for chaos has shifted ever higher. But we have an incoming president talking about unity at a time when impeachment proceedings are underway. Kevin, can you achieve unity as you're impeaching a president that is just leaving? How does that work down in Washington?
You know, historically speaking, I'm struck by the only similar precedent that we have, and we're in uncharted territory here, but when President Ford pardoned President Nixon, and he did so, it was a deeply unpopular decision, but one that he later said he did in order to unify the country and move forward. What we heard yesterday from Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell on the Senate floor, continuing to raise questions about the president's responsibility for the attack on the Capitol, in many ways could be argued as a unifying message for Republicans, as the Republican Party looks to see which direction it will be headed in, not just in the upcoming midterm elections, of which they made gains in the House of Representatives, but on the cusp of another presidential cycle, a time in which Vice President Mike Pence, who will be in attendance today, is also keeping his own political options open. So there's a lot of unknown variables, and ones that are not clear right now, Jonathan, but important questions that are being asked for the entire country that will play out over the next couple of weeks. And as you correctly mentioned, the biggest unknown is whether or not he will be convicted in the Senate.
I mean, right now we are looking at shots for everyone tuning in on Bloomberg Radio at President Trump landing at Joint Base Andrews in the helicopter. His family waiting there to watch him off, including Ivanka Trump and Jared Kushner, not wearing masks, their son wearing a mask, looking at their watches, waiting for their president to come down. Right now, he is about to exit the helicopter in his final act as president of the United States, along with First Lady Melania Trump. And I just wonder, Kevin, when we look back on President Trump's tenure as president of the world world's biggest economy. What do you think will be the biggest takeaway? How will history wash this presidency in a year, 2 year, 5 years' time?
Unprecedented. It was a time of division. It was a time of political unrest and upheaval. It was a time in which democratic institutions were questioned, but which democratic institutions continued to hold strong. And we're seeing that process play out virtually behind me, virtually in real time as President Trump departs for his private residence in Mar-a-Lago in Florida. And we'll continue to see that process play out in the Senate impeachment trial. But it was a time of great unrest, and that is how this president will be remembered.
Kevin Cerulli at the Capitol, and now the President of the United States and Mrs. Trump up on a podium with a rail as they listen to a numerous gun salute. I'm not quite sure if it's 21 guns or 12 guns or something more traditional. The President providing an arm, flexing an arm, I should say, of support for those assembled at Joint Base Andrews, and we're looking for comments from the President. He comes to the lectern as we await a final comment from the President of the United States. Waiting for audio now to come in to us here at our Bloomberg studios. Here now, the President of the United States.
Thank you very much. And we love you, and I can tell you that from the bottom of my heart. This has been an incredible 4 years. We've accomplished so much together. I want to thank all of my family and my friends and my staff and so many other people for being here. I want to thank you for your effort, your hard work. People have no idea how hard this family worked. They worked, and they worked for you. They could have had a much easier life, but they did a fantastic job. I just want to thank all of you, everyone. I want to thank Mark Meadows, who's here, someplace right there. I want to thank Mark. But it's been something very special. We've accomplished a lot. Our First Lady has been a woman of great grace and beauty and dignity. And so popular with the people, so popular with the people. In fact, honey, would you like to say a few words, please?
Being your First Lady was my greatest honor. Thank you for your love and your support. You will be in my thoughts and prayers. God bless you all. God bless your families. And God bless this beautiful nation. Thank
you. What else has to be said, right? But what we've done, that's true, honey, great job. What we've done has been amazing by any standard. We rebuilt the United States military. We created a new force called Space Force. That in itself would be a major achievement for a regular administration. We were not a regular administration. We took care of the vets, 91% approval rating. They've never had that before. The vets have given us, the VA, the vets have given us an approval rating like has never been before. We took care of our vets and our beautiful vets. They were very badly treated before we came along. And as you know, we get them great service, and we pick up the bill, and they can go out and they can see a doctor if they have to wait long periods of time. We got it so that we can sadly get rid of people that don't treat our vets properly. We didn't have any of those rights before when I came on, so our vets are happy, our people are happy, our military is thrilled. We also got tax cuts, the largest tax cut and reform in the history of our country by far. I hope they don't raise your taxes. But if they do, I told you so. And if you look at the regulations, which I consider the regulation cuts to be maybe even more important, that's why we have such good and have had such good job numbers. The job numbers have been absolutely incredible. When we started, had we not been hit by the pandemic, we would have had numbers that would never have been seen. Already our numbers are the best ever. If you look at what happened until February a year ago, our numbers were at a level that nobody had ever seen before. And even now, we really built it twice. We got hit. Nobody blames us for that. The whole world got hit, and then we built it again. And now the stock market is actually substantially higher than it was at its higher point prior to the pandemic. So it's really, you could say we built it twice. And you're going to see incredible numbers start coming in if everything is sort of left alone. Be careful. Very complex. Be careful. But you're going to see some incredible things happening. And remember us when you see these things happening, if you would. Remember us, because I'm looking at elements of our economy that are set to be a rocket ship up. It's a rocket ship up. We have the greatest country in the world. We have the greatest economy in the world. And as bad as the pandemic was, we were hit so hard, just like the entire world was hit so hard. Places that thought they got away with it didn't get away with it. They're suffering right now. We did something that is really considered a medical miracle. They're calling it a miracle, and that was the vaccine. We got the vaccine developed in 9 months instead of 9 years or 5 years or 10 years or a long time. It was supposed to take a long time, many, many years to develop a vaccine. We have 2 out. We have another one coming almost immediately, and it really is a great achievement. So you should start to see really good numbers over the next few months. I think you're going to see those numbers really skyrocket downward. And I can only say this, we have worked hard. We've left it all, as the athletes would say, we've left it all in the field. We don't have to come and say, we'll never say in a month when we're sitting in Florida, we're not going to be looking at each other and saying, you know, if we only worked a little bit harder. You can't work harder. And we had a lot of obstacles, and we went through the obstacles, and we just got 75 million votes, and that's a record in the history of sitting presidents. That's an all-time record by a lot, by many millions. In the history of sitting presidents, it's been really just an honor. One of the things we're very, very proud of is the selection of almost 300 federal judges and 3 great Supreme Court justices. That's a very big number. That's a record-setting number. And so we've done a lot, and there's still things to do. The first thing we have to do is pay our respects and our love to the incredible people and families who suffered so gravely from the China virus. It's a horrible thing that was put onto the world. We all know where it came from, but it's a horrible, horrible thing. So be very careful. Be very, very careful. But we want to pay great love to all of the people that have suffered, including families who have suffered so gravely. So with that, I just want to say you are amazing people. This is a great, great country. It is my greatest honor and privilege to have been your president. I will always fight for you. I will be watching, I will be listening, and I will tell you that the future of this country has never been better. I wish the new administration great luck and great success. I think they'll have great success. They have the foundation to do something really spectacular. And again, we put it in a position like it's never been before, despite the worst plague to hit since, I guess you'd say, 1917, over 100 years ago. And despite that, the things that we've done have been just incredible. and I couldn't have done it without you. So just a goodbye. We love you. We will be back in some form. And again, I want to just, in leaving, I want to thank our Vice President, Mike Pence, and Karen. I want to thank Congress, because we really worked well with Congress, at least certain elements of Congress. But we really did. We've gotten so much done that nobody thought would be possible. But I do want to thank Congress. And I want to thank all of the great people of Washington, D.C., all of the people that we worked with to put this miracle together. So have a good life. We will see you soon. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you very much.
The President of the United States, we welcome all of you on Bloomberg Radio and Bloomberg Television, doing it his way. Comments made at Andrews Air Force Base on his way to Florida. The common theme for me there was a circle back to the profound impact of the change from February to March of this year, and of course the beginning of the pandemic. We welcome all of you. Again, here is Vice President Biden, the president-elect, I should say, has been at Blair House across from the White House, no doubt giving this president his time, his final moment as the president greets the assembled, including Ivanka Trump. Jared, I believe I saw Laura Trump as well. I'd like to turn right now to the president-elect at Blair House, and Kevin Cirilli. The symbolism of the moment for this nation is absolutely profound, and I really feel Kevin Cirilli has not been talked about enough. This is a president-elect who, unlike in 1960, will travel to the Cathedral of the Catholic Church for a bipartisan service. Kevin, it is remarkable how religion has changed since the tumult of 1960.
Precisely. President-elect Biden will be the nation's second Catholic president, the first being President John F. Kennedy. He will do so at St. Matthew's Cathedral, where President Kennedy was actually laid to rest. And he's using religion as a way to bring together bipartisanship in Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell and another Catholic, Speaker Pelosi. But it's remarkable to listen, to hear, to observe President Trump's final remarks that we just heard him make. He barely thanked his own vice president, Mike Pence. He did not thank members of his cabinet. And he did leave the door open to some type of continuation of Trump politics. But now all attention will turn to the incoming Biden administration.
Well, Kevin, do you think that that's the right emphasis, that President Trump didn't thank his vice president and members of cabinet more vociferously? Or is it that he took a relatively conciliatory tone and didn't necessarily double down on the election and some of the questions that he's raised in the past?
Well, he can't, because he's got a trial that he's got to prepare for, probably the most important, significant trial of his life. And this trial in the Senate is at a time in which Republicans are openly questioning whether or not he should be convicted for the attack that happens at the Capitol. And should he be found guilty of those charges, then he will not be able to seek political office again. So a lot of question marks about where the Trump political orbit moves from now. But the first person that he thanked was his chief of staff, Mark Meadows, who was there with him. And that would appear to be a signal that is who he feels is still very much in his corner as he heads down to Mar-a-Lago to readjust and recalibrate.
When it comes to future steps, when he says that we will be back, and he talked about how he's not going anywhere, do we have a sense of what exactly his plans are in terms of either running for office in 2024, starting a media company, some of the other speculations that are out there?
Yes, in terms of the conservative landscape, Chris Ruddy of various conservative media platforms has been having the president's ear with regards to a potential new type of conservative network to counter some of the Murdoch properties. Secondly, there's open speculation that Ivanka Trump has senatorial ambitions in the state of Florida, as well as Donald Trump Jr. having congressional ambitions in counties like Jupiter in Florida. Thirdly, Lara Trump has been looking openly about potentially running for some type of higher office in North Carolina. But when you look at all of the various possibilities that could play out, the Trump political brand has taken a significant hit in recent weeks. Whether or not they're able to rebuild, we don't know. They still do enjoy popularity amongst a certain contingency of the conservative movement. It's unknown whether or not their path forward is still there.
The contrast of this 2021, Kevin Cirilli at the Capitol and with us through this day of celebration of the presidency of Joseph Biden, Emily Wilkins at Freedom Plaza as well. And also away from Air Force One is the automobile in the car quietly ensconced near the White House and Blair House for Mr. Biden. We'd like to bring in right now, as Mr. Biden attends church at St. Matthew's Cathedral from Iona College, Jeannie Zano joins us, and Rick Davis joins us from Stone Court as well. We now have the automobile leaving Blair House, and this is, of course, Mr. and Mrs. Biden moving off to church. Jeannie, the symbolism here that we have this morning, the differences here of this visit to a church versus the visit by the president to a church in the riot and storm of Black Lives Matter last summer, it's just as stark as anything in this nation.
Yeah, absolutely. And by design, I think, you know, the Biden incoming administration has really been focused on making a case for bipartisanship. This is somebody who spent his life in the Senate. He understands, as he gets set to send a huge immigration bill to Congress, maybe as early as today, to sign over a dozen executive orders to try to combat the coronavirus with this almost $2 trillion bill. He understands he is going to need the support of Republicans with this Senate so narrowly divided. And as he is trying, I agree with Kevin, to use the trip to the church symbolically, and he's going to be accompanied by members of the leadership on the Republican side to make the case for bipartisanship, which we're going to hear an awful lot about unity today in his speech, I suspect, as well.
Maybe there'll be some prayers in the Republican Party as they consider a new Senate in not a fracture, but a more fragile House. Rick Davis joins us now with his service to the gentleman from Arizona, Mr. McCain, over the years. Rick Davis, how does Senator McConnell pick up the pieces? What is the McConnell process as minority leader, even in the next weeks and certainly in the next months?
Well, Tom, it's hard to conceive that term, Mitch McConnell as minority leader.
Yes.
But he's already sort of tipped his hat. He's speaking pretty freely these days, which is somewhat unusual, about his plans as minority leader. And he did talk about the fact that in a divided Senate, you're going to need to compromise. And I thought I would never live to hear the word compromise come out of Mitch McConnell's mouth. But I think this is the new Mitch McConnell, and I think he'll use opportunities to ensure that legislation that does get through the United States Senate has his mark on it. He knows he can't control the agenda now, but he can impact the outcome of this legislation. And so I think that'll be his top priority, is just make sure that things don't get through the Senate that cause irreparable harm to the economy and to the policies of our nation.
When when Tom talks about unity and the fractures that we've seen in the Republican Party, it raises a question of who Mitch McConnell is representing right now, given the fact that a majority of Republicans polled, according to a number of different polls, still support President Trump, do not think that he should have been impeached or that he should resign. What do you make of that in terms of how it influences Mitch McConnell and his Republican Party as he charts his path forward?
So regardless of the public popularity within the Republican Party that Donald Trump has, Mitch McConnell actually gets to go to work tomorrow morning and do the nation's business. And so he will be one of a couple of national leaders who are going to form the Republican Party outlook on policy and politics between now and the midterm elections, which is the next real check in the system. And highly unlikely that there'll be a Trump on a ticket in 2022, but Mitch McConnell will have a large cache of money and is currently recruiting candidates for Senate races that are up in that period of time. So he's going to continue to be a very important mechanic of the Republican Party and a legislative strategist. And right now, he is about all we've got as a leader in the Republican Party.
Meanwhile, as we talk about fractures in the Republican Party, there certainly are fractures in the Democratic Party, Jeannie. And there's a question of how much Joe Biden will be able to bring together the left and center and right, frankly, of the Democratic Party in order to get through his policy. What is the unity like when it comes to the Democratic caucus?
The unity we're seeing today is going to be really the height of the unity we will see going forward. It is going to be tough for Joe Biden to keep this large, particularly in the House caucus, together. We've already heard frustration in some quarters of the progressive wing in terms of his proposal on COVID relief, for instance, saying things like that almost $2 trillion bill doesn't go far enough. And of course, you look at the opposite side on the Republican side, and even moderate Democrats, they say it goes way too far. In other words, what does a $15 minimum wage have to do with battling the coronavirus? So Joe Biden is going to have his work cut out for him, trying to keep the caucus together on the Democratic side and trying to please this really loud and energetic progressive wing of that party, because he's going to have to do that, and his focus is going to have to be trying to get to 60 in the Senate. And that means he's going to have to appeal to moderate Republicans and moderate Democrats, and that's not going to make the progressives happy. So all these bills we're seeing him talk about, from immigration to COVID relief, I suspect we will see watered down versions of that if we see them get through the Senate at all. And yesterday in Congress, we got signals it's not going to be easy. People like Josh Hawley holding up the DHS cabinet nomination, not fast-tracking it. Chuck Grassley saying he's got concerns about the COVID relief bill, amongst other things, with the liberal components of that in there. So those are signs already, before Joe Biden is even inaugurated, that this is going to be a tough sort of line for him to walk here.
Gina Zaino with us, and also Rick Davis here. And again, at the 9 o'clock hour, the Air Force One pulling away at Andrews Air Force Base, the president on his way to Florida. And outside the Cathedral of St. Matthew in Washington, we're waiting for Mr. Biden, I believe, to enter the church, and of course other worthies attending as well. The church is one of the jewels of Washington. It is a Lafarge at the turn of the 19th century. It is Romanesque. For those of you that know Boston, there's the church at Copley Square, which is much the same feeling, maybe a number of years earlier than that. Rick Davis, you know, as we go to this hour, as the president flies away, it is a changing of the era. And what's so interesting to me, Rick Davis, there's a huge presumption with Biden at 78 that this is a one-term presidency. I believe in my life, I've never understood this was a one-term presidency as much as this moment. How, Rick Davis, does the assumption of a one-term presidency change the moment?
Yeah, it's a very good point, Tom. Joe Biden, because of his age, is probably termed out the day he gives his swearing in. So it is something to remember. Kamala Harris is a new vice president, as has been remarked many times, historic. And she is going to be seen as an heir apparent to Joe Biden for a presidential run in 2024. The question is, can Joe Biden be relevant over the next 2 years in order to ensure that he doesn't start acting like a lame duck president? As we recall, in the last term of Barack Obama's presidency, he was almost termed out in the first year of his second term. People saw him no longer as the future. And so policy waned and legislative action slowed down. Biden's got some momentum, and he can ride it as long as he can, but the political realities are that he isn't the future of the Democratic Party.
Two of you, thank you so much. I know you'll be giving us guidance and wisdom through the day. We greatly appreciate it. Gina Zaino of Iona and Rick Davis as well this morning. Lisa Bramowitz and Tom Keene with John Farrell. John, let's reset the market right now. Futures up 20. John, I guess they advance off of the words of President Trump.
Equity futures up 20 points on the S&P 500. I don't know if off the back of the words of President Trump, Tom, but certainly off the back of more plans to introduce more stimulus into this economy. And this administration has big plans to do just that, Tom. They'll be hitting the ground running, and this market's running away with the idea that from here, policy making gets a little less chaotic, and from here, this economy opens up a whole lot more as the vaccination program rolls out. That's the story for this market. This market has been unfazed by the chaos of the last couple of weeks in Washington, D.C., Tom. It's been focused on the policy and the policy effort that's still to come.
Of the trillions of dollars as well. Lisa, I mean, that's the serious moment here, the linkage of what we're observing today with the realities of economics, finance, and investment. You're measuring it in trillions of dollars and percent of GDP.
Yeah, indeed. We are going to be looking for yet another monumental stimulus package. But just going back to what John was saying, the idea that this market has been unfazed by the turmoil and the sort of unease that we've seen in Washington, D.C., perhaps the leg up that we're seeing in equities as the market grinds closer to the open is just simply because people are seeing it is going to be a somewhat orderly transition going back to the normal course of things. There was some question about that in the weeks leading up to this, Tom.
I mean, John from Capri emails in and says, quote, the Russell 2000. I mean, John, NASDAQ and Russell 2000 alone showing the spirit that we've seen the last couple of weeks.
And let me tell you, I'm missing Capri, Tom. I'm missing Capri a lot right now. We'll be counting you down to the opening bell on Bloomberg TV, on Bloomberg Radio. Fortunately, the three of us staying together through the next 60 minutes. A fantastic lineup going up into the opening bell. Henrietta Trays of Vader Partners, Tom, will be joining us just a little bit later. Looking forward to catching up with Priya Misra of TD as well. I think that's going to be an important conversation about the amount of debt that we will see under this administration. And I think key differences as well, guys, that we need to discuss. We came out of the last crisis and President Obama had to confront the Tea Party and an effort to tighten things and go through austerity. And to some degree, President Obama also accepted that they had to tighten up things as well. This is a complete sea change. You have a former Fed chair who was conditioned by the last cycle, the end of the last cycle specifically, about the premature declaration of victory. And she does not want to make the same mistake again. Chair Yellen becomes Secretary Yellen, Tom. She has a different seat and also faces the same set of decisions, the same risk that you declare victory too soon. And I don't think she wants to make that same mistake twice. And this market gets it. This market gets it.
Well, the humility there of Chair Yellen is earned. I can remember a number of speeches at the Economic Club of New York where she was fiery about the need to persevere. President Trump perseveres. It is always a glorious sight. A 747 Air Force One off to Florida. And we welcome again all of you on Bloomberg Radio and Bloomberg Television. Lisa Bramwitz and Tom Keene. The privilege of joining John Farrow, I say, in this 9 o'clock hour. We're beginning to get images, John, from within the Cathedral of St. Matthew's. I did not expect this. Good to see that as well. It is a spectacular Romanesque church directly north of the White House, up quite a distance. It's a travel north there as well. But again, the service is to be attended. Not a packed church, but nevertheless nicely crowded here. And of course, there's the issues of the pandemic as well. The Bidens at a church service. John?
Kevin Cirilli joins us now from Washington, D.C. Kevin, walk us through the next couple of hours down in Washington.
Biden exits the church. He will then continue to make his way toward the Capitol. Vice President Mike Pence will actually be one of the first notable guests to arrive here at the west side of the Capitol for the inauguration. Other members in attendance of government include members of the Supreme Court, including some conservative members whom now soon to be former President Trump had appointed to the church, to the Supreme Court. After that is when President-elect Biden, as well as Vice President-elect Kamala Harris, will make their way here. There will be a Pledge of Allegiance and then a singing of the national anthem by Lady Gaga. And then we will hear remarks from the incoming administration. So we're anticipating that Biden's address will last about 20 minutes. It will likely be one in which of a unifying tone. And then he will go to the White House, where he is expected to sign several executive orders reversing decisions of President Trump, including a decision to re-enter the Paris Climate Accords. He will also sign executive orders that will reverse some of the decisions related to immigration that he will then have to send to Congress. So a tall to-do list for the incoming administration, but he is trying to convey a message that he will get to work on day one.
Welcome all of you on Bloomberg Television, and particularly across this nation on Bloomberg Radio this morning on Sirius XM, and of course our signals in Washington, in Boston, in New York, and of course good early morning in San Francisco. Kevin, I think not enough has been discussed of the lady from California. The vice president today will make history. Do we expect to hear from Senator Harris, and what should we look for?
Yes, and I think a historic moment, a glass ceiling shattered for Kamala Harris, and it becomes the heir apparent to the Democratic Party, and her own political future very much really uncharted in terms of where she could take this, and really is expected to run for president after President Biden. She will be overlooking, and I think the symbolism of this moment is profound. When they take to the podium to address Washington, typically they would do so before the National Mall, before thousands of people. But there are no thousands of people. Instead, there are 25,000 National Guard who are all throughout the city to protect the city, and there are flags planted in the National Mall. Tom, I know you and I have been here before, where the flags that are pointed, a very, I can't stress this enough, poignant tribute to the 400,000 Americans who have lost their lives to COVID-19. It is truly a sobering sight to see.
Kevin, 400,000 people who have lost their lives. That's not including the millions of people who have lost their jobs, Kevin, and that is one of the questions as President Trump leaves and as President Biden gets inaugurated and Vice President Kamala Harris. The question is, how much will they try to push in the first couple of months of their tenure in terms of getting that 9.8 million Americans back into the labor force? What are you looking for beyond just some of the proposals as laid out in the $1.9 trillion plan?
Well, in addition to the executive orders that President-elect Biden is anticipated to sign later this evening, Lisa, one of those executive orders will be a federally mandated mask mandate on federal grounds. So any federal grounds throughout the country, it will be required for individuals to wear a mask. Beyond that, on the $1.9 trillion stimulus front, already it's running into partisan roadblocks. Republicans are uneasy about raising the cost of minimum wage, this at a time in which many restaurants, many sectors have been shut down because of the pandemic. So a debate ideologically around the minimum wage. On the $1,400 stimulus checks, some Republicans, like Senator Marco Rubio, a potential 2024 presidential candidate, has argued that they should pass this in a piecemeal approach. That is something that Republicans would like to see. Then you get to the Federal Reserve lending facilities. Look at the debate that Senator Pat Toomey has had with the outgoing now former Treasury Secretary Steven Mnuchin about those funds and how they should be activated. I mention all of this because while the pomp and circumstance and the pageantry of this moment is poignant, we also must be clear-eyed and realistic. There are several ideological economic issues in which both parties remain entrenched in their various perspectives.
Kevin, great to catch up. As always, stick with us, stay close. Kevin Cirilli down in Washington, D.C. for us through the day on Capitol Hill. With equity futures up 22 on the S&P 500, we advanced 0.6%, 23 minutes away from the opening bell in New York City this Wednesday morning. Joining us now, Henrietta Trace of Vader Partners, Economic Policy Director. Henrietta, let's build on the words of Kevin. The biggest policy battle down in D.C. still to come. Where does it lie?
I think the most interesting thing, and Kevin gave such a great roundup, is the reality that Senator Schumer is going to be controlling the Senate floor from here. So perhaps Senator Marco Rubio and others in the Republican conference want to hold out for the perfect. And they may be able to make some real changes, but when push comes to shove, it's going to be Majority Leader Schumer that decides which bills go to the Senate floor, and they're going to have to vote against a direct payment to individuals, against unemployment insurance benefits at the federal level, against more vaccine and testing funding for state and local governments. And that's going to be something that they have to wear that they have not had to deal with under Majority Leader Mitch McConnell. So I think that stark reality.
We've got a big number, 1.9 trillion, Henrietta, and we've had a big conversation the last couple of weeks about how much that will have to come down. Have you got a base case yet?
Yeah, my base case is that we probably end up at the very low end in the $750 billion range if they really try to get 60 votes, and 10 of which would need to come from the Republican conference. At the high end, maybe $1.5 trillion. I think that those negotiations will probably last until about mid-February, and then we'll have an understanding of whether Democrats are going to have to go it alone or continue trying to negotiate a bipartisan package. So it's going to be a couple more weeks here.
Henrietta, Tom Keene here, and good morning to you on this day of inauguration. Is the committee process broken forever?
In the Senate, I don't think so. I mean, if that's what you're referring to, I think that the committees are, especially with the senators, there's a lot of seniority there. So, for instance, there's a lot of attention on Senator Bernie Sanders, who will be chairman or co-chair of the Senate Budget Committee. They're going to come to an agreement on how to proceed. It may take a couple weeks to hash out, but there will be a path forward. They will divvy up committee assignments. There will be staff and budgets prepared for all of them. There will be a reconciliation bill, potentially even 3, depending on who you talk to in the Democratic conference, and this power sharing agreement will get sorted. An interesting thing to keep your eye on is whether any of the senators decide to leave either of their parties, become an independent, and caucus with the other side. Last time around, that's what happened. We could definitely see that again.
Yesterday, we heard Janet Yellen in front of the Senate Banking Committee. We heard a lot about the potential for taxation. This seemed to be a concern that Republicans were talking about as they were saying, we need to pay for this somehow. Do you expect that later this year, we're going to start hearing more about taxation from the Democratic Party?
It's a great question, Lisa. I don't think that the conversation about taxation is ever going to go away. I assume that in the first House bill that gets rolled out as early as next Friday, there will be some taxation components in it. Certainly, there would be in a $4 trillion or $6 trillion reconciliation bill down the line to offset infrastructure spending. But what members talk about versus what's possible in terms of actually legislating and getting 51 votes are 2 very different conversations. I can't find you the votes for tax increases. If there are any odds, it would come in very specific streamlined components applicable to very high net worth individuals or very specific income streams from very flush corporations. So the GILTI tax, the tax on intangibles held overseas, the capital gains tax. Those are conversations that could come up in the back half of this year. You'll probably see headline risk before then, but I don't anticipate that any of those tax rates will actually be implemented. If they are, there will be a phase-in. There will be a lag time. In 2023 is the earliest that I see any tax increases actually come into fruition.
In the meantime, do you actually see any true fiscal hawks left in Congress, or have they continued to remain extinct even as a Democrat takes office?
Well, that's a good question. I think the Republicans are trying to get back there, but Democrats are not really receiving that message right now. The biggest component of having Bernie Sanders as chairman of the Senate Budget Committee is that he's going to be responsible for deciding what the appetite is for deficit spending, and his appetite is pretty unlimited. When you have Treasury Secretary nominee Janet Yellen coming in yesterday and saying, we think that now is the time to deficit spend, interest rates are historic lows, there's not a real concern. And again, having control of the Senate floor and forcing Republicans and their fiscal conservative mantra to vote against these bills is much different than just avoiding these votes altogether. So I think fiscal conservative might be something that we hear in the background, but for all intents and purposes, it's dead for the time being.
Henrietta Trays of Veda Partners. Henrietta, always fantastic to get you with us. Thanks for joining us today as we count you down to the opening bell, 18 minutes away. Tom, the conversation we've got to have about the deficit, about the debt, you're about to get a whole lot more of it.
I think you are dead on, John, and it's going to be the debt and the deficit, which was a Heilbronner monograph from 30 or 40 years ago. And John, we are here. There's just no question about it, and it's a 3 trillion statistic. And John, I would suggest you got to be very careful here. I don't want to editorialize, but I think we're all numbed to the reality. It's just, okay, let's just spend the money because it is a natural disaster.
We have become desensitized by it. And Lisa, we've had the conversation many times over the last year. The conversation has shifted radically. The definition of a fiscal hawk 12 months ago compared to a fiscal hawk now, You're a fiscal hawk if you only want a $500 billion package. Let's be clear about that, because you're against a $1.5 trillion package, a $2 trillion package. The definition and our definitions of all of this have changed.
Yeah, although to be fair, even though the debt load has increased, even though the deficit has increased to the highest levels going back to World War II on a per GDP basis, if you look at the interest expense, if you look at how much the nation is paying for that, it has stayed lower. And that is the point that Janet Yellen was making yesterday, the idea that because yields are so low, the U.S. can afford to borrow more and that we can worry about it later. If we juice growth now, it'll be easier to pay back later, John. And this will be one of the key questions. How long can we continue to fuel the pump here and to get the economy going with yields remaining low enough to afford it? And that is one of the key tensions in 2021, John.
Have we converted Lisa Abramovich, Tom Keane?
Converted me to what?
Debt servicing costs.
Every 4 years, it's John. Every 4 years, it's a one-off. Every 4 years.
I'm just explaining the argument here, John. This is the actual nuts and bolts of the budget, and this is one of the key concerns going forward, especially if inflation does, in fact, pick up as most people expect.
John, I want to state here with the imagery, and again, we welcome all of you on Bloomberg Radio, the president-elect at the Cathedral of St. Matthew's here with the attended worthies, including Speaker Pelosi, Senator Schumer, Mr. Hoyer of Maryland, McConnell of Kentucky, and McCarthy of California as well. And also a capital that John Farrow, off of January 6th, and my surveillance math is 14 days ago. It is just, I didn't think I'd see this, John. I've got to be honest. It is beautiful.
The time has flown by.
With simplicity of vertical flags and, of course, awaiting a speech by the new president. John?
And each and every one of those flags has a very real meaning that means a lot to the people who lost someone through this pandemic over the last year, Tom. Joining us now, Priya Misra of TD. Priya, fantastic to get you on the programme. We've been reflecting on the debt load that we're about to see under this administration and the debt pile that's been built up over the previous administration as well. Just how closely will the Treasury and the Federal Reserve through the next 4 years work together, Priya?
So I think, they're independent organizations. The Fed is going to be looking at real rates. But I think should a rise in real rates happen, I think for some time, the Fed is going to let it happen. I mean, what we're hearing from the Fed increasingly is that the bar to ease further is high. So I think we've got to be able to take down all of the supply that's coming in. We expect another 800 billion to $1 trillion package, at least in the next couple of months, potentially more later this year. So I think the key tension is, as I think Lisa brought up, is I think that real rates are going to go up. And at some point, that's going to force the Fed in. I think just not yet. So I do expect interest rates to continue to rise in it.
Priya, in the blur of the Bloomberg world, I think I saw a few days ago a 50-year, half-century peace in France offered to record demand. From where you sit, is American full faith and credit debt just simply in enormous demand?
Well, there is going to be demand for U.S. Treasuries. It's one of the higher yielding bonds out there. So I think there will be that demand. We're continuing to see foreign investors buying Treasuries. In the very long end, I'm not so sure that there is that demand. And Treasuries, I surveyed the market in the past. I don't think there is demand for much more 20-year, 30-year, and even less so in the 50-year, because we just don't have that long duration pension liability that's forced to buy out the curve. So yes, there's general demand, but I don't think in the very long end as much.
Which raises a real concern for Janet Yellen and the others, especially because she did reemphasize yesterday in her testimony that she did plan to push a greater proportion of issuance into longer-term debt, locking in these very low interest rates. There is a question, what is the threshold of bond yields at which point the deficit becomes unsustainable? Priya, where is that?
So I think for it to get truly unsustainable, I think we're talking about much higher rates. But the market, the economy, the Fed, I think will worry at a much lower level of interest rates. And again, I would highlight, look at real rates, look at long end real rates. I mean, so much is made of the 10-year crossing 1%. 10-year real rates are at minus 1%. Clearly the market, the rest of the world has no issue absorbing treasuries here at minus 1%. If that gets closer to minus 50 basis points, or even as we're approaching there, I think the dollar, I think risk assets, the Fed, the economy, I think all of that starts to reverse some of the reflationary trade that we're having. And I think, you need that natural circuit breaker before debt sustainability is a true issue.
And John Farrow, John Norman at JP Morgan 3 hours ago was heated that he agreed with Priya Misra that the calmness here in the order of the markets was front and center, and there was just an insatiable demand to keep rates relatively low.
I think what Priya's talking about, though, and I think what's important here is what's driving yields higher. And if you decompose the move, if it's all break-evens, inflation expectation, it's not reals, then you won't get the Fed responding to that. And Priya, I think it begs the question, what is the threshold for tapering? What is the threshold for the Fed to do the reverse of that, to step in and put a cap on these yields?
Right. So I think the threshold to tapering is actually much lower than the threshold to hike. The Fed has been clear that they want an overshoot on inflation, which I think is a really high hurdle given a flat Phillips curve for them to hike. The threshold for tapering is vague, and all they've said is substantial further progress. So is 1.7, our forecast is at 1.7 or 1.8 on PCE. There is substantial progress towards that goal. So they taper at the end of at the end of next year. I think there are some Fed officials who are saying taper at the end of this year. So as the market starts pricing in this increasing divergence among Fed officials as to when to taper, I think we're talking about a pretty wide bid ask between the end of this year and the end of next year. The rates market should price that in, and which is why I think rates have some room to rise. And at some point when that mix shifts between break-evens and real rates, which could happen pretty soon if inflation fears are not founded, then I think, that's something the Fed and other, the economy should start to care about that real rate increase.
Priya, I was looking at a Bank of America, Merrill Lynch fund manager survey this morning, which said that basically an overwhelming number of investors believe that inflation will pick up meaningfully this year. What happens if they're wrong? What happens if, even though the United States is basically printing money and they're passing these massive fiscal stimuluses, they're just plugging a productivity gap and it does not lead to the same sort of price increases that people are expecting? What then?
Yeah, I'm actually most concerned about that scenario. This reflation trade has really taken hold. You can see it in the dollar price action or commodities or break-evens. And if that doesn't happen and the Fed doesn't respond right away, almost mathematically, real rates will have to rise and break-evens will fall. And now that becomes really damaging to the economy. At that point, I think the Fed should step in, but it's a bit like the taper tantrum. Remember, the market sort of ran away from the Fed message. And so I think the Fed has to be really clear. If inflation is not showing up and real rates are starting to back up, I think they need to come in and they need to look at the amount of debt that the market has to take down. I think RAM extension, nobody's talking about that. I think that comes back into the market psyche. If you do see that real rate increase, which could be all driven by no inflation, we don't see any inflation pressures here. We're still living through a very disinflationary COVID shock, which we still need to get past COVID for us to start thinking about inflation.
Priya, thank you so much. Greatly appreciate that this morning. Priya Misra with us with TD Securities as we consider the markets within this historic day. We welcome all of you on radio, all of you on television. This day of inauguration, we're doing economics, finance, investment, futures lifting through the day. 23.50 on the Standard & Poor's futures on a day of inauguration with bipartisan support. I don't mention Dow features to keep my colleague John Farrow on the edge of ecstatic. Thank you, Lisa, for that support. But we do welcome all of you for this special hour of radio and television. For those of you on radio, a stunning simplicity of a Capitol with vertical flags, clearly a message from the new president, is less red, white, and blue than what we saw from President Trump. But then if you turn around and look down the mall, it is extraordinary, the artwork of the many small flags substituting for people who could not attend because of pandemic and because of crisis as seen on January 6th. Rick Davis with us with Stone Court Capital. And also, Ginny Zaino joins us from Iona College. And Ginny, I want to go to what we're witnessing at St. Matthew's right now. This is the Catholic Cathedral. It's an historic church. And this is truly, Ginny, an ecumenical service with many in attendance from Congress. just supporting this president, and also a politically ecumenical Congress, a congregation, I should say, versus the stridency of the evangelical voice of the last 4 years. Compare and contrast what we've seen with what we have now, Jeannie.
This truly is an effort by the incoming Biden administration and, of course, supported by members of Congress from both sides after, as you mentioned, 14 days ago, the horrific events at the Capitol, to show and give a sign of unity. And it's incredibly important. I also thought the ceremony that incoming President Biden and incoming Vice President Kamala Harris had last night at the Lincoln Memorial, really for the first time as a nation, we were remembering those 400,000 people that John was just talking about who have perished in the last year. It's absolutely astonishing to me that that was really the first time we have seen the nation come together to pray and mourn for those victims and their families. And today, I think we're going to see something of the same at this very important church service. So the Biden administration really making its mark, saying our focus is on the victims of this pandemic, and our focus is on doing what we can to work across the aisle in Congress to bring the nation together and through this horrific health and also economic crisis that we've been in for the last year.
Rick Davis, I know you've got to go on to other duties this day of inauguration, but I do want to get this in. I thought of you when we saw what happened in Georgia, and that is a purpleness across the south of America, from your Arizona on over through Texas and all. Do you assume that we will see a more purple state America in the next 2 to 4 years, or was Georgia a one-off?
No, I don't think Georgia was a one-off, and I don't think Arizona was a one-off. And you can see other states like Texas with their demographic shifts toward more and more diversity becoming more purple. So, yeah, I think your analogy is right. This is going to be more purple. Look how close this presidential election was. A little bit goes a long way. I remember days when we elected presidents by wide margins, and now a wide margin is 10,000 votes in a state. So it's a competitive landscape, and I think that what we used to think as standard operating procedure in politics, you can throw that out. I think the future is going to be different than what we've seen in the past.
Rick, just a final question, because I know you've got to run. Unity is a word we've heard on repeat so many times in the last 24 hours. How do they look to unify a country as we still work through impeachment proceedings?
Yeah, I don't want to put a pall on today's events. This is a wonderful day. We should be celebrating. Unity is a theme that almost everybody uses on inaugural day. I can't remember, other than maybe Donald Trump's speech 4 years ago, every president talks about unity on inaugural day. That being said, Joe Biden's a partisan. He's run for president 3 times. He's been part of an Obama administration that all its major initiatives were done on a straight line party vote. So they will not let unity get in the way of passing their legislative strategy and continuing to lay the groundwork for Democratic wins in the future, especially a very tough election coming up in 2022. So I think it's a great theme for the day. I think there are things like Jeannie Zaino just talked about with today's church service, the Lincoln Memorial yesterday, talking about unifying the country on issues like COVID and our health. But let us not pretend we are in an intensely partisan environment, and Joe Biden wants to win on his agenda, and he'll use every political trick in the book to do it.
Very good. Rick Davis, thank you so much for joining us today. And Jeannie Zaino, thank you so much as well. I want to draw your attention to special broadcast today on radio and television at Bloomberg. At 11 a.m., David Weston leading our coverage as we continue forward to the inauguration. Of course, those events at 12 noon, but much happening and good conversation in 11 a.m. hour as well. John?
Tom, the opening bell, about 3 minutes away, and there's a lift to this market. Equity futures up by around about 24 points, and the S&P 500 up 0.6%. We reflected on this a little bit earlier. Lisa, we're already there at the year-end targets for the likes of Citi, Bank of America, SocGen, Stifel. Stifel had a 6-month call to get to 3,800. We were 500 points south of where we are now when that call was made 3 months ago. This market's moved quickly.
Yeah, and the question is, how much good news have they brought forward, and what do we have to see to actually justify it at this point? Does not seem to be a concern for people. They seem to say potentially the upside is to the surprise, not the to the upside, not the downside. And I'm looking right now at markets that are not necessarily confirming the rotation, and that's sort of interesting in today's action. The Nasdaq outperforming here, up 1.2% ahead of the open, John, which I find interesting, even though you see the S&P and even the Russell 2000 underperforming here, people piling into what's worked, saying the momentum will continue with the status quo reestablished.
Well, what's worked is the small caps, 40% since the start of November as we work through the political uncertainty down in Washington, D.C. And I think more importantly, the biggest move, I think, in the last 3 months, and I don't think it's controversial to say it, Lisa, has not been the political developments, it's been the developments on the vaccine. The developments around the vaccine has just allowed everyone in financial markets to look through the chaos of the back end of this year and into early January as well in 2021 and look out to a better back half of this year, Lisa.
But John, it's a complicated effort, and I was really struck by yesterday. I was walking around my neighborhood, and there were long lines outside vaccination places. People have been waiting there for a very long time. New York City is set to run out of vaccine this week, possibly by tomorrow if there isn't a re-upment shipment. Timing matters. What happens if we don't get that rollout more quickly, Tom? And that seems to be a real concern that affects the economic outlook dramatically, especially without a clear bridge to the other side.
John, I know we've got to get the market open, but I'm pleased to announce I will be vaccinated tomorrow.
Really?
Yes.
Congratulations.
My ancient age.
I did not know that.
We want pictures.
It's been super top secret.
I thought they started the over 70s a long time ago.
They did. Thank you, John. Very nice. I knew that was coming.
When is he going back to Capri?
No, the only thing that's good, John, as we go to the open is I get to take Vet Bill with me to hold him and hug him.
Oh, yeah?
Tom, I'm happy. Hopefully you and I can go to Central Park and have a cigar in the next couple of weekends. Right. I'm happy for you. I really am. The opening bell just around the corner in New York City with equity futures up 25 on the S&P 500. We advanced 0.7%. In the bond market, the story, yields just a little bit higher. No drama here. The 10-year yield up by a basis point or so on a 10-year to 1.099%. In foreign exchange, starting to see that dollar weakness continue. Cable breaking out to a 137 handle a little bit earlier. The Aussie top of the pile in G10 up by around about 0.5%. The Aussie dollar since the start of November up around about 10 percentage points. That's the story. Cross asset worldwide at the opening bell to get you a breakdown and get you some movers. It's Katie Lyons.
Well, John, I want to take a look at the shares of Netflix because they are soaring about 13% at the opening bell after a big beat on subscribers in the fourth quarter. Came in at about 8.5 million, about 2 million ahead of estimates, bringing the total to around 200 million. Thank you very much to the Queen's Gambit and also to Bridgerton. Elsewhere, you have in tech, Alibaba is higher this morning. It's all about optimism about Jack Ma after he was seen in public for the first time since the end of October. If this gain today holds, it will be the 5th day in a row up for Alibaba. We also had the last of the big banks reporting this morning. Morgan Stanley beating across the board from trading revenue to investment banking. That stock higher by more than 3% as a result. You have Procter & Gamble, though, lower by about 1.5%, even though it beat in the second quarter and lifted its guidance for the full year. Elsewhere, we have autos on the move, John. I want to start with General Motors because it is record high after record high for this stock. It's up another 2.5% today. Follow on optimism about Microsoft's investment in Cruise, its self-driving venture. You also have Ford higher by about 2.7%. The analyst over at Deutsche Bank raising his price target on the stock to $11 a share, up from $9. It's trading at about $10.28 this morning. And of course, we have to talk about Tesla. You can't talk about autos without doing that. Oppenheimer slapping a street high price target of $1,036 on the stock, citing its extraordinary edge in the EV space. That stock trading at $853 a share this morning. And another EV maker, Nikola, is higher by about 1.3% at the bell, a rebound from its 7% decline yesterday, John.
Katie, thank you. Nice bounce in this market. Then the Nasdaq advancing a little bit more than 1%. Intraday record high on the Russell. The small caps absolutely ripping over the last 3 months. On the S&P, we have a clean move through the S&P 500, 3,800 level. 3822 is where we are. there and thereabouts, up 0.6% on a session. Around about 3 months ago, Barry Bannister of Stifel came out with a 3,800 price target. We were around about 3,300 back then. It was a 6-month target. 3 months later, we're through it. Barry Bannister joins us right now. Barry, we have moved quickly in the last 3 months. I imagine people are lining up to ask you the same question they're asking Citi, SocGen, Bank of America. When are you going to lift your price target, Barry?
Jonathan, this is either a major top, like the mid-1960s, where the S&P leveled out for a long time as we achieved some gradual reflation. You know, we'd spent 5 years at 1.5% inflation up to 1965. Then we had guns and butter. Today we have this war on climate. We have all this social spending and deficits due to the virus. We achieved about 1% per year of increase throughout the late 60s of inflation, and the market just kind of leveled out. We had a couple of bear markets, actually, in that 5-6 year stretch. When I look at this, it's going to pivot on the real 10-year yield, the TIPS yield. That has been what's driven up our PE to 26 times our forward estimate, 23 times the street's estimate. If the TIPS yield rises on better economic growth, it's better for value than growth, and it's better for small than large, and for EM over DM. We shall see what happens. But if they repress the 10-year yield, we can go higher, yeah.
Is that a nuanced way of saying the following, Barry? If the economy gets better and yields go higher, that's not going to be good news for the benchmark in the United States, or the index level on the S&P 500?
Yeah, let's keep in mind, the equity risk premium formula is just earnings over price, or earnings yield, minus the real yield, the TIPS yield, the 10-year TIPS. So if you're going to force, like Powell did in the last 2 years with the Powell pivot 2 years ago, the TIPS yield from +1 to -1, you're doing minus and minus. And essentially you're forcing down earnings yield and up PE. And these are big, big moves. We're talking, 10 multiple points, 15 multiple points in 2 years. So it all hinges on yield repression at the real yield level, and then whether we can generate earnings and recovery in 2021 and 2022.
Well, let's get to the earnings component of that calculation. Your EPS estimate, Barry, is a solid 11% below the street starting point. What is it that you're seeing that you think others are getting wrong?
I was not optimistic about the vaccine rollout. I remember the swine flu back in the late 70s. It got to about 30% and then had some side effects, and they pulled it. There's inertia when it comes to vaccines. People are slow to take them up, and of course the distribution system relying on the state health authorities has been slow. So I knew that we would have a slow uptick. The thing about fear is fear comes on quickly and dissipates slowly. And so I did not expect a big first half for earnings, and as a consequence, that and some other cyclical and adjustment factors at the sector level, we were 11% below the street this year, yes.
Barry, good morning. Tom Keene, thrilled to talk to you. I remember, Barry, long ago and far away, even before Legg Mason, you held court in capital goods and were so good, Starmine had to retire the award. You won it so many years. So you're the perfect guy to talk to about the malleability of the American corporate executive. Are they going to adapt and adjust? And is the biggest surprise forward margin support and earnings support, because these people will adjust to the cards they're dealt?
There's no doubt, Tom, that corporate America is adjusting to a different tax outlook. Certainly, deglobalization is still with us in many ways. President Trump was transformative, controversial. A lot of people who are transformative are controversial. Steve Jobs got fired before he got rehired back in the 80s, and he founded Apple, which is arguably one of the best companies in world history. But when I look at the outlook and what we said 20 years ago, and what's interesting now is stocks relative to commodities, S&P divided by a monthly commodity index that we've reconstructed, that is at a high, and that is where it was in 2000 in the tech bubble. And so value would lead if stocks began to underperform commodities, which is a symbol of reflation and a weaker dollar.
Barry, there is a consensus right now that the U.S. will underperform emerging markets, that small caps will outperform large caps. Do you think that all of the consensus trades are right, or do you think that they have set up for squeezes that are going to end up being what marks 2021's surprise?
The small cap, emerging markets, and value are all the same trade. They are reflation. And so it's short duration cash flow in the case of value. It's long duration cash flow in the case of growth stocks like tech. So it's essentially a battle between can we achieve curve steepness and will there be reflation or not? If we don't have reflation, we pour all this money into the system. Jonathan asked earlier what would drive the market substantially higher. It's Fed repression of the real yield, a soaring PE, a lack of inflation, and lots of money.
You know, Barry, I love this. I come on for the special hour with John Farrow this day of inauguration. John, we hit record highs. It's just something, John, about your reappearance. I love it.
We do get record highs on the Russell and the small caps and elsewhere as well. Barry, great to catch up. Barry Bannister of Stifel. We get better guests in this hour as well, Tom.
It's amazing how that works.
More often.
Absolutely amazing.
I know, it's incredible. Joining us now from Washington, Emily Wilkins, I'm pleased to say. Emily, a lot going on in the next couple of hours. Run us through things.
So right now, Biden is leaving church, President-elect Biden, rather, is leaving church with his wife, as well as several congressional leaders, Republicans, Democrats. He's going to be heading now to the Capitol, where he will go from President-elect Biden to President Biden, being sworn in today, along with Vice President Kamala Harris becoming the first woman vice president, first female vice president of color. From there, they will be going to Arlington Cemetery, where they will lay a wreath on the tomb of the unknown soldier, and from there, Biden's going to return to the White House and get straight to work, signing at least 15 executive orders, ranging from rejoining the Paris Climate Accords to extending moratoriums on evictions.
Emily, I'm glad you bring this up of Arlington Cemetery. What do you expect will be the relationship of the legislative branch and the new executive branch to the Pentagon?
So Biden has already emphasized the need for a strong defense, strong homeland security, has started working to get people into those positions. Certainly after what we saw with the insurrection at the Capitol, as well as other security concerns, such as the hacks from the Russian government, defense is definitely going to be a priority that's going to have to be addressed quickly within the Biden administration.
There's also a question about the pandemic response, and soon-to-be President Joe Biden has talked about expediting some of the vaccinations in terms of the schedule. What do we know in terms of how he plans to do that, given that so much has to be done on the legwork side of just getting shipments to the distribution centers?
Well, we've heard President-elect Biden talk about trying to make sure that he is getting 1 million vaccines out in his first 100 days, really trying to make sure he's speeding up the process here. He's proposed funding for vaccines with his $1.9 trillion coronavirus stimulus bill. That's something, obviously, that Congress will still need to pass. He's also making sure to keep Dr. Anthony Fauci as a part of his new administration. We expect Fauci to be addressing the nation later this week.
Emily, great to catch up. Emily Wilkins there down in Washington, D.C. on Inauguration Day in the United States of America, with an equity market just off all-time highs on the S&P 500, on the Russell, on the small caps. We're already there. That big rotation sparked, not by the politics, but by the vaccination effort that really took off at the start of November. That vaccination effort, many people will ramp up, people think will ramp up under the incoming administration. Joining us now is Michael Purvis, Tallback and founder and CEO. Michael, talk to us a little bit more about that. The political events of the day, how they translate into a boost into the vaccination effort, and ultimately what that means for this market.
Yeah, well, you know, it's an important day on many levels here. I would say, I think in terms of the political backdrop and how it's going to impact markets, you know, we've seen a lot of sort of chaos over the last couple of weeks, and the markets grind right through there. I think one thing that obviously we need to get the vaccines rolled out, and the more successful that is, the more constructive it is for risk assets and for the and certainly for the rotation trade, as some of your earlier guests were commenting on there. I think there's a broader issue also, which is how does the fiscal stimulus sort of couple with the vaccine stimulus going forwards? And I think that's obviously going to be a sort of a key pillar of the strength of this continued sort of upward momentum here. So look, I think it's going to be a very nuanced thing, and let's always remember that fiscal stimulus isn't administered in the way monetary stimulus is. It doesn't come with shock and awe. It comes in, it's a often tedious, sometimes unseemly sausage making exercise that's not particularly efficient. So that's to me just as important as sort of the vaccine stimulus, certainly from a near-term perspective.
We'll continue with Michael Purvis. We welcome all of you on Bloomberg Radio and Bloomberg Television across this nation and indeed worldwide as well, particularly radio listeners worldwide. We greatly appreciate a digital effort. A cabinet assembles at the Capitol for their president. It will be interesting to see. I believe we had a sighting of the mayor of South Bend, Indiana, and others selected by Mr. Biden. Some controversy over that part of the debate with Kevin Cirilli and Emily Wilkins to follow in the coming days. Again, David Weston joining at 11 o'clock. Alex Steele and Guy Johnson along here in about 15, maybe 18 John Farrow minutes. Michael Purvis, I want to go back to what you and I always lead with, which is the Pacific Rim indicators. What of the Pacific Rim indicators like Asia DXY, what have they indicated in recent days about a strength of global recovery?
Well, they're certainly reflecting the strength of the emerging Asia-China-centric recovery there. You're seeing that, reflected, in the strength of the Chinese currency. You're seeing it reflected in the some of the option markets. If you look at the Korean won volatility levels, those, broadly tend to track with the VIX, and particularly when global geopolitics or sort of a global deflationary shock is on the rise. That's been actually those are really at very, very historically low levels here. So all that's reflecting is that the Asian economic rebound just seems to be the more obvious one right now. That's one of the reasons why I kind of shifted into this EM overweight just last week. Is that they certainly have a sort of a cleaner COVID platform to work from, and the macro momentum there is really quite strong.
The obvious move right now, Michael, is the move that we're seeing in Netflix. Tom, we're up by 13, 14 percentage points. And Tom, you and I talked about this earlier on this morning, the transformation of this company, just as competition is getting even greater. It's just phenomenal, right, Tom.
Well, it is. I mean, we can talk a lot about this. And a major surveillance shout out, John Farrow, to Paul Sweeney that's really led on this. And, I look, Michael Purvis, at this and, I mean, we're watching these equity markets. Do you equate, Michael Purvis, that something like Netflix that is creative can do the shift from debt in large CapEx over to free cash flow like a more traditional company, say Comcast of years ago? Are they truly an equivalent?
Last night, but it looks like they're certainly starting to do that, right? And that's been the trajectory of a lot of major tech giants, Google and Facebook. They have the strongest balance sheets we've seen of any corporate in decades, right? So that's certainly the benefit of an asset-light business model with a strong moat when it works, right? If you're lucky enough to actually achieve that, that will produce that will certainly lower your equity market risk premium and help support valuation going forward. So the benefits are multitude. Yeah. Not that it's easy to do there. Tom, there's one thing I just want to talk about here, which is that the FANG story, the big tech story, has been sort of on the back burner really since it had that record overstretch in early September. And, obviously it's been small caps and all that kind of stuff that have been, sort of the flavor of the last couple of months. I think as more earnings unfold here, I think people will once again be reminded that big tech is sort of the backbone of the broader equity rally here.
And well, that's exactly where I wanted to go. Not only the backbone of the broader equity rally, but also the U.S. dominance, frankly, when it comes to equity performance. And there's a question, especially with the focus on Twitter and Facebook and the controversy over President Trump's account, of how much that technological preeminence will be challenged by Congress. Do you get a sense of regulatory pressures or anything that could potentially put a damper on the enthusiasm around big tech? Or do you think that that is really going to be a whisper that does not come to the fore for a long time?
I think more the whisper that does not come to the fore. I think these are very complex assets that are complicated to understand. These are not. It's different than breaking up Standard Oil or regulating, sort of a hard asset company in several respects. So I would expect that there's a very long path between angry congressman or senator and actual policy that really is shareholder disruptive. What you may see is more of a sort of European style, sort of taxing, if you will, of these fining and taxing of these tech monopolies going forwards, and that would put obviously pressure on margins there. But I don't know if it's really disruptive to their sort of unique ability to generate very high quality and high earnings growth there. So it's
Michael,
a very, very difficult thing.
Equity market is flying. I just want to jump in quickly and wrap up the conversation on where we are, where we've been, and how your job is going to change. We all have a routine. We wake up and we go through that routine every single morning. You reach for the newspaper, you read the FT, you go to the Bloomberg, you have a look at Top Go, you have a look at Read Go, all of those things. Check where futures are, the bond market, etc. 4 years ago, people had to introduce something new into their routine. They woke up several hours earlier and they checked their Twitter account to see if the president had tweeted. Things are going to change in Washington, Michael. Things might go back to the way they were before, where it's a little bit quieter around the White House. You wouldn't have a change of policy, or at least people wouldn't perceive that policy was going to change imminently. How will things change for you, Michael?
Well, that's a great question. I do think that, obviously this one thing that Trump ushered in was this sort of the sort of Twitter obsession where so many people, like, he kind of really needed to follow Twitter if he wanted to follow politics and policy. So I would suspect many facets of that will survive into the future going forwards. With all that being said, I think some business models like Facebook may be exposed. Their earnings may be exposed just to simply that we're no longer in an incredibly intense election year. There, I don't know how much of the revenues are from political advertising there and so forth. But I do think that's one of those things. One of those sort of company-specific watchstones I would look for. In terms of my personal behavior, yeah, I don't think I'm certainly not going to get. I'll be looking for what the Biden White House tweets out, and it's an effective form of aggregating perspectives and information. Therefore.
Michael Purvis, thank you so much for talkback, and greatly appreciate the perspective this morning, particularly on the Pacific Rim. We welcome all of you again on radio, on television, worldwide and across this nation. The imagery of a different inauguration, no question about that. That's what 25,000 National Guard troops will do, and of course what we're seeing, a motorcade of a type coming in. Of course, lots of black limousines in Washington. We all know that. But the drop-off of the worthies at the Capitol, and again, so different. Because of the pandemic, seating will be separated. Nothing like the image of Abraham Lincoln at his first inauguration, or the wonderful images we saw in our Bloomberg footage earlier this morning. John, I really can't say enough about the starkness of all of these inaugurations from my childhood, and this is not one of those. This one is different.
This one was always going to be different because of the pandemic, and this one became much more divisive because of the events of the last couple of weeks. we have to bring in the market to this conversation as well, Tom. And we touched on this earlier in the hour. What's been amazing is just how unfazed market participants have been by the events down in Washington, D.C. And in many ways unfazed by what's happened with the pandemic as well, largely because there is an expectation that we get back to normal and get back to normal quickly because of the vaccination effort that is taking place in the United States of America and worldwide as well. When it comes to policy, this market seems to believe that the Democrats in control of the House, the Senate and the White House could be a market-friendly outcome. I don't even think we've started the conversation about redistribution in the economy yet, Tom. And that's the conversation that we will be having in the years to come with the Democrats taking control of much of Washington.
A redistribution is British talk, folks, for taxes up. And there's a wide assumption that we'll see taxes up. But, John, I wonder in what way will they be up in the titanic battle between individual taxes and corporate taxes as well. Dow up 76 right now. SPX up 24 points. John Farrell framing at 3,900 right now. We need an update into this hour close with our Kevin Cirilli. He is overlooking the west side of the Capitol out to the mall as well. John, the cabinet of Mr. Biden, Kevin, the cabinet of Mr. Biden begins to assemble. Is it the cabinet you expected weeks ago?
Yes, largely it is. And I think that what you've seen from the opening testimony, Tom, of the officials who started their testimony yesterday, Yellen, Blinken at State, has been smooth sailing, so to speak. There have not been a significant hiccups in terms of the process. I would note, as the music behind me picks up, as the pomp and circumstance begins, I would note that from a timetable, though, they're running about a week behind. Typically, a new administration would want to see their cabinet officials already confirmed within the first day or two of getting through the process. But as Senate Minority, soon-to-be Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer put it, they've got to have an impeachment trial. They've got to confirm the cabinet, and then they've got to pass economic stimulus. So this is going to be an incredibly busy Congress in the next couple of weeks.
Kevin Cirilli down in Washington, D.C. on Inauguration Day in Washington in the United States of America as President Donald Trump, number 45, heads to the exit, and Tom Keene, Joe Biden, becomes the 46th President of the United States of America.
Well, he does as well. And, of course, we're seeing the congregation leave St. Matthew's right now. After that ecumenical service at the Cathedral of the Catholic Church in Washington. But, John, it's going to be something to, the action today and the first day of an administration. John, I'm a lot more interested about the 14th or the 140th day of this administration to see how they struggle with the divides of the nation.
This country is in both a political and economic crisis still. A pandemic that we need to work through, and there is a lot of work still to be done. We talk a lot about 100 days, the first 100 days, the honeymoon period. Let's be clear about this. There is no honeymoon period for the incoming administration. There is a lot of work to do. For our audience worldwide, heard on Bloomberg Radio, seen on Bloomberg TV, this was a special edition of the Bloomberg Surveillance Simulcast alongside Tom Keene and Lisa Abravis. I'm Jonathan Ferro. With Inauguration Day dominating events down in Washington, D.C. and attracting the attention of the world. An equity market in the United States advancing to all-time highs. The S&P 500 up 0.7%. The NASDAQ up by 1.3%. The world reflects on the 4 years we've just worked our way through and anticipates the 4 years still to come under President Joe Biden and how he'll tackle the events of the moment. A pandemic that still is claiming too many lives and a vaccination effort that needs to ramp up quickly. For our audience worldwide, this is Bloomberg.
China continues to be, recovering well. And with the opening up that was decided at the last 5-year plan, that is a golden opportunity for many international banks.
So we'll look to double our footprint across IB and also wealth management and asset management in the 3 to 5 year time frame.
Growth outlook structurally is very strong, but it does need to consolidate and allow time to help the share price appreciation to move more in sync with the growth.
So China can avoid further decoupling if they stop these inappropriate actions.
But at the moment, we really want to see the dust settle first on international relationships, on China's role in the global economy.
I don't see a likelihood of a big change in the policy with the change of administrations.
Our generation's biggest problem.
Climate change is happening.
And the world's most innovative solutions.
Transport, industry, buildings, electricity, all of those things.
Everything you need to know about our changing environment, the politics of global warming.
We can and we will deal with climate change.
In the fight against climate change, Bloomberg Green has you covered.
This is the 1980s all over again, to make sure that we keep our hands firmly on the driving wheel.
I do not see demand coming back to the pre-COVID level anywhere earlier than the end of 2022.
If that happens and we see a demand recovery, then I think the market can absorb it.
3 p.m. in London, 10 a.m. in New York, 30 minutes into the trading day in the United States. From London, I'm Guy Johnson. My co-host in New York, Alex Steele. Welcome, everybody, to Bloomberg Markets. Alex, the stock market greeting Joe Biden with fresh record highs.
Yes, it is now Biden's turn. You take a look at the NASDAQ, for example, is the one I want to single out, up over 1%. Part of that's going to be the Netflix story. But this is where the other markets are setting President Biden up to take over. Bloomberg Dollar Index pretty much goes nowhere. It's a mixed dollar story. But the yield story, that's what we were paying attention to yesterday during Janet Yellen's confirmation hearings, the Treasury Secretary. And are we going to see a higher range bound now for the back end of the curve and for the back end of the year as well? Guy?
We need to cover a developing story as well that's happening here in Europe. Within the last hour, we have seen a massive explosion in Madrid, destroying 3 stories of a building near the city centre on Toledo Street. We don't know, Alex, what has caused this massive explosion. As details begin to emerge, we will bring them to you.
In the meantime, we want to take you back to the main story of the day. President-elect Joe Biden be sworn in as the 46th president in just about 2 hours. Joining us now from the Capitol's inauguration stage is Kevin Cirilli, Bloomberg Chief Washington Correspondent. Kevin, who's there? Where are we?
Marine Band just started playing as the official ceremonial portion of the inauguration of President-elect Joe Biden now formally underway. Earlier this morning, President-elect Biden attending church services with a bipartisan group of congressional leaders trying to showcase that they hope to change the tone of Washington, to get back to a tone of bipartisanship. Then we are anticipating to hear remarks from Vice President-elect Kamala Harris, as well as President-elect Joe Biden. Kamala Harris, of course, becoming the first female vice president, shattering a glass ceiling. And then this new administration is hoping to project that they are getting to work on day one. At the White House, they will then sign a series of executive orders, including rejoining the Paris Climate Accord, declaring a requirement to wear a mask on federal grounds, and also sending new immigration policies to Congress. But it all comes as President-elect Biden's cabinet is making its way through the confirmation process. We heard yesterday from the Senate Finance Committee with likely Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen about the need for more economic stimulus. That is the top priority of this administration in the first 100 days on the domestic front, is to get $1.9 trillion worth of economic stimulus through. And to do that, they are definitely going to need Republican support.
Absolutely. Kevin, thank you very much indeed. Kevin Cirilli in Washington. Our thanks to the band as well. Stay with Bloomberg for coverage of the inauguration. Our lineup of guests includes Connecticut Governor Ned Lamont and former New York Police Commissioner Ray Kelly. It all starts at 11 a.m., of course, in New York, 4 p.m. here in London. Let's get more insight now on President-elect Biden's economic program. We heard a great deal yesterday from Janet Yellen. Joining us now, Bloomberg International Economics and Policy Correspondent Mike McKee. Mike, Kevin talking about the relief package, the stimulus package. My question is, given how wafer thin the majority is that the Democrats are going to enjoy, what is the timeline for getting this done? When are Americans going to start feeling the benefits of the Biden administration?
Well, Guy, that really depends on how they bring this to Congress in pieces. There are pieces that could go through, but if they bring it as a big package that includes things like the minimum wage, it will take longer. A piecemeal approach might get something out the door by, say, the end of February. Now, I have to apologize. I don't have a band here. I'm just by myself. But you can't, you got to forgive Joe Biden if he comes to office today with a sense of deja vu, because he's now been sworn in under economic circumstances very similar to when he was sworn in as vice president in 2009, with the economy sort of in free fall and needing support, needing a stimulus program. Now, if we have this chart that I brought along here that shows where GDP and jobs are now and where they were in 2009, the jobs recovery was very, very slow. And economists say that's because the stimulus package then was too small and didn't last long enough. And they're going to keep at it this time. They're not going to make the same mistake. You mentioned the $1.9 trillion package. That means checks for people, money for states and cities. There's the chart I was showing you, the blue line underneath, the long, slow labor market recovery. You can see the big hole we're in. So if they get checks out, money for states and schools, vaccines and testing, that's the most important thing, because they say we need to make sure the pandemic is conquered before the economy comes back. Extending unemployment, small business loans, tax credits for childcare, all those things have some support. The question is, do they have enough support to go through together, or do they have to cut it down? Joe Biden's not going to get all that. Some of it, state and city aid, particularly controversial. His proposal for rising the minimum wage, that's going to be really tough. But he comes back later in the year with a job-creating infrastructure program, we're told. That'll be controversial because it'll be focused on climate change. But he hopes to be able to get some part of that through, because he insists we can pay for it through increased growth, because interest rates are so low. The U.S. interest payments as a percentage of GDP are lower now than they were at the turn of the century when we had budget surpluses. So Joe Biden takes office under similar circumstances, but he's determined that he is not going to have the same results as in 2009.
All right, Mike, appreciate that. Bloomberg's Michael McKee. We're also watching former President Clinton and Secretary of State Hillary Clinton arriving on Capitol Hill as well. The other market event we're taking a look at here are banks, still raking in that fourth quarter profit despite that weak economy. A very different story than 2008 when Joe Biden was vice president. Morgan Stanley reporting this morning, beating estimates across the board. Bloomberg's Sonali Basak is here with me. Sonali, give us the highlights.
So we have the investment banks here firing on all cylinders. And now that we have everybody's results, we have the stars aligned on Wall Street. Everybody is leading in the businesses they're known to lead at. Morgan Stanley, #1 in equities trading. JP Morgan, #1 in fixed income trading. And Goldman Sachs keeping a strong lead in investment banking numbers. For Morgan Stanley, the stock is up today because they also beat on wealth management. They are currently outlining to investors how big that opportunity can get now that they also own E-Trade.
Bloomberg's Sonali Basak, thank you very much indeed. We'll be back with Sonali a little bit later on in the program. Let's have more on that bank story now. Big banks results doing, well, mixed business on Wall Street over the last few days. Marty Mosby of Vining Sparks joining us now to give us his take on all of this. Marty, is there more still in the tank? These banks have had an incredible run. Morgan Stanley's up 44% since November the 9th when we got the Pfizer news. They are doing great business in a number of different lines. Can it be continued?
Well, what you have is several of these items where they're hitting the beats are, trading. If you look at Bank of America, JP Morgan, it's release of reserves that were built earlier in the year. So you have some of this, euphoria around this recovery in earnings that is, when you kind of look through it, not quite as sustainable. And you see that as you look into the 2021 estimates. So there is still some pressure underneath this, which is low interest rates have a dampening effect on earnings, and that will hold back some of this momentum if you have some normalization in some of these favorable things. So to continue at this pace is not reasonable, and at this point we think they're caught up with what they look like in the outlook going into 2021.
Hey, Marty, I mean, a lot of what we've also seen is that these banks just have a lot of cash, but the lending portion really isn't moving. And obviously, it doesn't apply as much to Morgan Stanley as it does to the other guys, like Citi or Bank of America. But what's the conversation in the bank community among that?
So what you're seeing is that you're exactly right. The loan growth in demand hasn't really been there, especially for the larger banks, that a lot of their customers can have free access to very low interest rates inside of the capital markets area. So they can, issue debt, they can issue stock, and so then they don't really need the bank loans nearly as much. The Fed has created a lot of liquidity in this market, so that's kind of bidding away some of what you would see in that normal kind of progression in working capital. The other thing is that the market and the economy is stabilizing, but it's not really, shooting out and growing. We're not really in an expansionary period. So that loan growth really is an issue. The second side to that is with interest rates being so low and the Fed pushing those interest rates and keeping them down there and creating so much liquidity, loan pricing is under a lot more pressure. We went through this last time. Credit spreads widened out. The yield curve steepened. So there was a lot of earning asset yield available for banks to be able to kind of invest in that. If you look at it today, it's half of what it was in 2015, through 2012. So that opportunity is really where you're going to see a lot of that pressure that will eventually kind of continue to kind of ebb into these balance sheets as we go into next year.
Marty, what does E-Trade mean for Morgan Stanley? We're about to see a fresh round of checks going out. You wonder if some of that money is going to end up being invested. The retail boom has been huge this year. Does that continue? Is that sustainable as well?
That part of it is. So the part of the story with Morgan Stanley, which is interesting, is even if you kind of take out the, let's take the spike of all this trading and investment banking and all this that happened this year, and we kind of roll into next year's earnings. From 2015 to now, you'll actually see, even under that kind of base, Morgan Stanley has strategically doubled its earnings by what it's done in wealth management, what it's done with its efficiency and its trading operations, with what it's done here in the E-Trade acquisition. So there is a sustainability to Morgan Stanley with the strategic initiatives that they've had. That's pushed their returns up. It's increased their earnings, and that's the real long-term momentum that you're really kind of investing in a bank like Morgan Stanley.
Marty, they're called Robinhood traders, even though they can sort of trade on any platform. And we've seen call options really soar. You've seen stocks that don't have a lot of revenue really pop. They're very different from the beginning of this rally that we saw back in 2020, when it was the big tech guys, the recovery trades that would go on and off as winners and losers. And I wonder how you think of an incoming administration with that. Do you see some kind of heavier oversight, more questions as to that kind of trading?
We'll have to see how the whole regulatory environment evolves from here. The key behind all of this is that the survivability and the balance sheets of the banks is so much stronger than what we had back in 2008. So it wasn't about survivability. It wasn't about really the regulatory, demand of all the excesses that were in place that needed to be dealt with. So we had a wave of regulatory changes because the financial system had gotten way out over its skis. Survivability, safety, and soundness is much better in the financial system than what we had then. So there will be little things like we talk about here that will definitely be fine-tuned, but I don't think there's the need or the willingness to kind of go in and have to, overhaul everything like we did with Dodd-Frank and like we did with the capital requirements and liquidity requirements. I think we're in a much better place than we were in that last downturn for the financial system as a whole.
Marty, do you think the bank's going to be under pressure to play a bigger role in uniting America? Do you think the bank's going to be encouraged to play a bigger role in closing the income gap, lending out some of the huge amounts of money they have on their balance sheets, as Alex alluded to? Do you think that pressure is going to be there, and what does that mean for investors?
So I think the banks, and if you look at it, really the community banks on the front line have been the ones to be able to adapt. So if you look at the PPP program, the community banks only make up about a third of the assets in the U.S. banking system. They represented over 2/3 of the PPP loans that were rolled out. So I do think, the essence of what we were trying to do in Dodd-Frank is trying to kind of move the pendulum back towards Main Street and allowing some of these community banks and regional banks to kind of step in and be able to be closer to the customer, take care of the customers. The market share gains, if you look at lending's growing in community banks. It's not growing in the banks that you're seeing with these headlines. If you're looking at deposit growth, it's keeping up with the whole industry as a whole. So I think there's going to be more of a push back towards regional and community banks and keeping the pressure on those bigger banks. And there'll be some, I think, encouragement to participate for the bigger banks to be able to try to do what they can. But I think really to kind of equal the playing field, we need to continue to let our regional banks and community banks step in and help those folks that can come in and tell a story. The big banks have to standardize everything, so they can't really adapt to that, but the community banks can, and showed that this year.
Hey, Marty, it's always good to catch up. Love your insight on the banks. Thanks very much, Marty Mosby of Vining Sparks. Thank you very much. We've also been watching arrivals on Capitol Hill. You just saw a Senate soon-to-be Majority Leader Chuck Schumer, Senator Amy Klobuchar as well, also former Secretary of Transportation Elaine Chao, as well as current Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell. All right, now we're going to take a look at what it means for the broader stock market as well. Burns McKinney, Allianz Global Investors Portfolio Manager, joins us. Banks make up 9.4% of his portfolio. JP Morgan, his #1 holding. He also owns Morgan Stanley and Citigroup. Burns, it's a twofold question. What good news is already priced into the stocks? With the exception of Morgan Stanley, if they report good numbers, the market didn't really care that much this time around.
We did see a little bit during the bank earnings season so far. We've seen a little bit of a reversal from what we had last year. Last year, the market allowed some of the banks to have some really mediocre earnings, and the stocks popped a little bit. And in this case, the expectations have risen, and you've seen a lot of the banks. Morgan Stanley, JP Morgan, they reported record earnings, and at least in the case of JP Morgan, the stock sagged a little bit. And so the expectations have been raised. A lot of that's been a result of at the beginning of this year, you've seen a steepening of the yield curve. But nevertheless, we do believe there's a lot of room to run. I think that really one of the most important factors is that after the global financial crisis, a lot of the financial services firms demonstrated that they really had improved their balance sheets, improved their liquidity. They'd taken on more asset light business models, and the market didn't really give them credit for it. It's a little bit of a prove it. And what we've seen is that a lot of the financials have come through the recent recession really in a lot better shape than most of their clients. And so they've demonstrated that, and it really does suggest that there really perhaps would be a re-rating upward. And and clearly a lot of them have also learned from past mistakes. Morgan Stanley showed today, as well as any, that they really are benefiting from the fact that they've transitioned. They're probably not getting full credit for it, but transitioned to a more asset-light, asset and wealth manager.
Burns, hasn't that re-rating already happened? These stocks are up big since we got the Pfizer news on the vaccine. They've really ripped higher, outperforming many, many other sectors. What would drive a further re-rating that's not already in the price right now?
I think that the first thing is you need consumers to have cash in their pockets. I think the prior guest suggested that the steepening the yield curve is the first step, but the second step is that you need loan growth, and that would probably whether it's a stimulus package again to improve the livelihoods of the bank's customers would probably be first and foremost one of the key things. But again, the financial services sector has really is on much more stable footing than it's been in many years, if not ever. I think one of the things that we've seen coming out of this earnings season is that cash as a percentage of assets is now actually higher than it was prior to the pandemic. Loans to deposits ratios are actually lower, suggesting that they're in really good shape with respect to that. And the most recent stress tests were some of the most challenging that they've ever had to go through, and a lot of them went through with flying colors. And the next step would probably either be the consumer being in better shape, as well as coming out of that stress test, there was a suggestion that coming up later this year, there might be the opportunity to return capital to shareholders. Morgan Stanley CEO suggested today that being able to buy back shares and raise the dividend in the coming year will definitely be a priority. And I think that would probably sort of allow these to take the next leg up.
So Burns, one of that's idiosyncratic in terms of returning cash to shareholders and to be the catalyst, but the other is more macro. So let's get to that. I mean, the consumer does better. That means you get the stimulus. The proposal is $1.9 trillion. I have yet to see any economist or political strategist think we're going to get that number. The most I hear is 1.1, but I still hear numbers below that $1 trillion mark. What number is penciled in for your look on the equity market?
We don't have a specific area or range where we have to sort of hit that bogey for the stocks to take off. But you suggested 1.1. I mean, you're talking about when you combine that with the $900 billion that was passed at the end of last year. You're talking about real money as a percentage of GDP. I think a lot of these factors, that the minimum wage increase probably wouldn't make it through reconciliation. So I think there'll be some challenges there. But nonetheless, I mean, this is definitely one of the top priorities for the new administration. If you take this plus the prior one, and likewise, if you put I think $1,400 of checks in the consumer pockets on top of the $600 that passed in December, then I think that'd be a fantastic start. And I think that the stock market has begun to price that in, but it's not fully there yet.
Burns, where do you see the U.S. 10-year at the end of this year?
I'm certainly, we're stock pickers here. We're not in the business of necessarily suggesting where interest rates are going to go.
But you've got to factor it into your thinking. We're 1.1 now.
Absolutely.
If we get up to 1.5, if we get let's say it up to 2%, how does that change the narrative in terms of the way that you're positioned?
Well, I think that I think a lot of the forecasts are suggesting that at least 1.5% later this year. You're clearly saying that with the latest stimulus package, on top of the fact that we have the vaccine rollout's been slower than expected, but nonetheless, I think that should ramp up. When you look at those, I think in the back half of the year, you could see north of 1.5% on the 10-year, and that's something that it factors in. I think that if you look at some of the areas that might be winners and losers, again, going back to the topic we were just touching upon, the financials would definitely be winners there. In a more reflationary environment, it might be positive for energy in the back half of the year. It's something that I think it might present challenges to some of the bond proxies. Your utilities, some of your consumer staples might be a little bit more challenged. But we do expect to see that reflationary environment take place later this year.
So Burns, before we let you go, aside from some of the banks that we drilled down into, what's sort of your top pick for 2021?
Yeah, I think for 2021, probably, rather than necessarily making a top-down macro call, thematically speaking, infrastructure is probably a great way to play the markets this year. It's something that, Wayne Gretzky used to like to say, don't skate to where the puck is, skate to where it's going. And where the puck is the current COVID relief plan. But going forward 2 or 3 quarters, where the puck is going is going to be that infrastructure package. That's something that it makes a lot of sense from the perspective of it provides stimulus. It's good policy. U.S. infrastructure is aging compared to a lot of comparable countries, and it's something that would enhance productivity going into next year. And so, looking through and I'm not just talking about roads or ports or airports, but digital infrastructure, enhancements on broadband connectivity and 5G, or likewise, enhancements in energy efficiency. One great way to play that would be something like a Honeywell. It's something that they are one of the leaders in building controls and smart thermostats. And so, any incentives to improve energy efficiency is something that they'd be clearly one of the winners from.
Burns, a great pleasure. Thanks for spending some time with us today. We really appreciate it. Burns McKinney of Allianz, thank you very much indeed. We continue to monitor what is happening in Washington. For more on the stimulus, the U.S. economy, and Biden's first 100 days in office. Joining us now, Matt Bennett, Third Way co-founder and former deputy assistant to President Bill Clinton, who we saw arriving a few moments ago. Matt, thanks for your time today. This is an inauguration like no other. There are no crowds. We have got huge numbers of troops in Washington. Both of those stories really tell a story and narrative for the first 100 days of the Biden administration. You have to get in control of this vaccine, of this virus, and you have to get in control of a way to reunite this country. What do you expect from the first 100 days that are going to deliver on both of those two narratives?
Well, I think what you see today will be the kickoff to a very frantic period of trying to put this House back in order that Donald Trump has left in such a catastrophe. And what you'll see today is symbolic, of course, but also very important.